Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in which time zone. I'm Gerald Winslow. I help to coordinate the Adventist Bioethics Consortium, and I want to welcome you warmly to this fifth conference of the consortium. I would love to say the fifth annual meeting, but we had to postpone last year's meeting, so this is the fifth meeting, but next year, we hope to meet again and pick up where we intended to be this year, which is in Orlando, Florida. We've been welcomed by AdventHealth. Thank you, Ted Hamilton and crew. I see you here for that invitation. And we hope by then we will be through the pandemic and we will be meeting in beautiful Orlando. We've planned 3 half days for this conference. There are ample breaks because we're familiar with what Zoom fatigue feels like. And we're imagining the rest of you are too. All the participants will be muted during the conference, except for the speakers and the conveners and the hosts. You're encouraged to use the chat function for comments and questions. And you'll see it there, usually at the bottom of your screen. We'll monitor that and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. We also encourage you to chat privately with your friends and colleagues. We've left that function on. One of the joys of meeting in person for such conferences is the hallway conversations. So just think of that chat function, speaking to or writing to friends and colleagues you see at a distance and greet them if you choose to. We've chosen to leave that function on. I'm delighted to introduce our devotional speaker for the 3 days. Dr. Carla Park is one of our longtime colleagues and friends at Loma Linda University, one of the directors and the longest serving director of our center here for spiritual life and wholeness. And Carla is now the executive director for Faith Community Strategy for AdventHealth. She's going to give us our devotional talks. And Dr. Park, Carla, time is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Winslow, for inviting me here to speak today. At this consortium, I will present 3 devotional talks. Each one addresses a different aspect of ethics for the ministry of healing, and each devotional has 4 parts: scripture, science, life story, and poetry. Scripture comes from the Bible, both Old and New Testament, and the science comes from a variety of scientists and studies. Life story will come from my own and others, and the poetry I use comes mostly from William Stafford. The title of this devotional is Holy Awe, an Ethic of Wonder. Everyone was gripped with great wonder and awe, and they praised God, exclaiming, "We have seen amazing things today." Luke 5:26. But why? What have they seen? What has just happened in Luke 5 that would make the onlooker, or the writer in this instance, describe it like this? Wonder seized them, reached out and grabbed them, and then filled them up. Like a glass fills up to the brim, to its entire capacity. Wonder grabbed them and filled them with awe. But it's an ordinary day. The sun is hot as a man teaches from a small house, and suddenly there's the sound of thatch and boards pulling and tugging, and a hole appears in the roof of the house. People stare. You would have stared too if you were there. Through the ceiling, a cot descends. Slowly, as strong men above lower it inch by inch, or was it foot by foot, tilting and swaying? It is a cot with a paralyzed man on it. Nothing unusual. In the absence of good medicine, pitiful circumstances are everywhere, but not usually descending from the ceiling. My uncle was paralyzed from the neck down. I've seen scenes like this a lot. Times when my father carried my uncle and placed him on the carpet of our living room. So a scene where a man is held by the strength of others is an ordinary scene unless the man is your uncle. And then the world becomes a dazzling place as you watch the powerful arms of your father offload your uncle onto a pink blanket. Your sins are forgiven, says the teacher standing close by, and upon seeing the commotion asks, well, which is harder, to say your sins are forgiven or get up and walk? Well, I yell quietly to myself in this moment because, or just as any niece or daughter of that man would have, both, I yell. He needs both, says the child within me. But my adult self knows that this day is too ordinary, too bound up in finite human existence to hope for either. That's when the paralyzed man jumps up and exits the scene. Wonder seizes us, fills us with awe, and leaves us standing in our incapacity to quell the thunderous finitude within us, suddenly flung into a heavenly realm. In that moment, we understand the situation differently. This is what happens when we open ourselves up to the larger meaning of what is around us. One stormy autumn night, when my nephew Roger was about 20 months old, I wrapped him in a blanket and carried him down to the beach in the rainy darkness. Out there, just at the edge of where we couldn't see, big waves were thundering in, dimly seen white shapes that boomed and shouted and threw great handfuls of froth at us. Together we laughed for pure joy. He, a baby, meeting for the first time the wild tumult of Oceanus, I with the salt of half a lifetime of sea love in me. But I think we felt the same spine-tingling response to the vast roaring ocean and the wild night around us. This story reminds me of a moment that I had with my nephews, but I didn't write this story. It was written by Rachel Carson, the author of the book Silent Spring, but published in a smaller book after she died called The Sense of Wonder. The spine-tingling response that she refers to is the wonder and awe mentioned in Luke, the sense that the ordinary has just become extraordinary, to be grabbed by wonder and filled up with awe. She, Rachel Carson, worried that increasingly we were looking about with unseeing eyes, becoming partially blind. The boredom and disenchantment of adult life was crowding out the freshness and clear-eyed vision that we had as children, where everything was full of wonder and excitement. We were losing the deeper instinct for what was truly beautiful, becoming alienated through preoccupation with the artificial. And then she wanders into ethics by concluding that it is our moral obligation to give each child, ourselves, and others a sense of wonder so indestructible that it would last throughout the life. We must pave the way for others to want to know rather than to force knowledge, to become receptive to what lies all around us, seeking to understand, to ponder the mysteries together. So is it in fact easier to say your sins are forgiven or get up and walk? To learn to use all of our senses to get at the deeper mysteries that whisper from every leaf, from the written page, and from every wound and illness that threatens to undo us. It is not enough to have a question. We must develop the habit of asking questions. It is not enough to see beauty where it is intentionally displayed. We must notice the hidden beauty in the smallest things, the average moments, the ordinary days, the people around us. To ask ourselves, what if I were seeing this for the first time? What if I knew that I would never see this again? Then would I realize the wonder of it all? And if I ponder long enough, will I begin to see that ethics for the ministry of healing must begin with an ethic of wonder? To be able to be seized by wonder and filled with awe in relation to the ordinary, to be pulled outside of myself by curiosity and begin to understand that which I cannot name or have no words for, to take the time for what does not demand it. You, reading this, be ready. That's the title of the poem I'm reading by William Stafford. Starting here, what do you want to remember? How sunlight creeps along a shining floor? What scent of old wood hovers? What softened sound from outside fills the air? Will you ever bring a better gift for the world than the breathing respect that you carry wherever you go right now? Are you waiting for time to show you some better thoughts? When you turn around, starting here, lift this new glimpse that you found, carry into evening all that you want from this day. This interval that you spent reading or hearing this, keep it for life. What can anyone give you greater than now? Starting here, right in this room, when you turn around. We must be willing to act, to be absorbed, seized by the wonder of what we find, and in the absorption to be filled and fulfilled as our understanding deepens. So, which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven or get up and walk? The answer is not nearly as important as promising ourselves that we will ask and ask and ask again, knowing that we will be filled with wonder and awe in the asking, and we will understand more because of it. On an ordinary day, a paralyzed man jumped up and walked out. He left us standing in holy awe at the wonder of it all. What will happen next, right in this room, when you turn around? Let's pray. Lord, teach us to explore, to question, to engage what we see and hear. Help us to inspire others to want to know more, to understand more, to be insatiable in the quest, and then to rest in the dazzling wonder of it all as we are filled to the brim with holy awe, even by things we don't understand. Make this the foundation of ethics for the ministry of healing, for who knows what you and we together will do next. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Park, Carla. What a rich opening for our conference. We'll have time for just a brief break here now. Mostly we'll have 15-minute breaks, but not right now because we're going to go into our keynote address. And I'll take just a moment to make sure that our next speaker has co-host responsibilities or authority and can share screen if you want to, Bob. It's no exaggeration to say that members of our executive council for the Bioethics Consortium specifically asked for Dr. Macauley to return. He comes to us today from Oregon Health and Sciences University and beautiful Portland, Oregon, or nearby, where Bob, as we call him, is the professor of pediatrics. He earned his MD from Yale University, residency at Johns Hopkins. He's board certified in pediatrics and also in hospice and palliative care. He's produced a remarkable 2018 book, Ethics in Palliative Care, a complete guide. And he lives with his wife and 4 amazing children there in the Portland area. His topic today for us is Devout Requests for Maximal Treatment, Sanctity of Life, or Crisis of Faith. Bob, welcome. We really look forward to what you're going to share with us.
Thanks so much, Jerry. And it's very nice to be with you all. I have to confess, selfishly, I was hoping we would all be together in person. I would reflect on our world being a safer place, I imagine, and also give us the opportunity for in-person fellowship. But I'm grateful for this opportunity to see some familiar faces and have a chance to share with you all this morning. So we are going to look at devout requests for maximal treatment and what that really means. So we're going to have a few objectives for this morning. One is going to look at some empirical data on the impact of faith on health decisions. We're going to look at competing values and obligations that affect those decisions. And we're going to explore the reasons that devout patients make the choices they do and look at how we might support them both clinically and spiritually. So a little bit of background that I think is probably familiar to all of us. Christianity promises that the faithful will have eternal life in heaven. And there are various verses that we could point to. These are a couple from the Gospel of John that clearly point to that. So as Christians, we have something to look forward to. There's also a very profound contrast between earthly life and heavenly life. So Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, he talks about, we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. And in the first letter to the Corinthians, Paul writes, so will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. So if we just want to do the math, at most, this is Pastor Rick Warren, we will live 100 years on earth, but we will spend forever in eternity. And if you want to look at it on a timeline, what we're looking at in our temporal life is a fraction, a tiny, tiny infinitesimal fraction of eternity. And so we have much to look forward to, not only in terms of time, but in terms of quality. So logically, faithful Christians should be looking forward to heaven. We might be so excited that we can hardly wait to get there. We might even be tempted to take a few risks on earth to say, like, well, what's the worst that could happen? I'm going to get to where I'm meant to be for all eternity. Or maybe earth can be kind of scary and we take steps to not have that happen too quickly. But all the while, we would be watching for what happens next. We would be preparing for what happens next. And one would think that if that exit ramp was right in front of us, very close by, that we would be very eager to walk through those doors. So I'm going to put forth a fundamental argument. And the first is that given that eternal bliss awaits faithful Christians should look forward to heaven. Now, the second part of that argument talks about how faith impacts medical decisions. So the majority of people, not just people who espouse a specific faith, but the majority of people in the United States say that religious beliefs would guide medical decisions if they became critically ill. And for some subsets that have been found in the literature, like lung cancer patients, personal faith was extremely high on what drove them to make the decisions that they made, sometimes second only to what their oncologist or specialist would recommend. Now, this is a very famous study that was done about 20 years ago. Granted, it was in the VA context, so it's veterans, but I think that it has a lot to teach us. And what they did is they asked people, what were the most important things that you looked at the end of life, your most important considerations? And as you can see, patients and bereaved family members ranked being at peace with God number 2, second only to freedom from pain. Physicians and other care providers ranked at number 3, coming after presence of family. So both groups very, very high, being at peace with God. Studies have also shown that spiritual support improves quality of life. So when you look at spiritual support, this is a study from Balboni in 2007, and there are two Balbonis, husband and wife team, who have written a really wonderful book recently on hospice and end-of-life care that kind of brings together much of their research over many, many years. One is a physician, one's theologian. Spiritual support was a major predictor of quality of life at the end of life. So we've already established that eternal bliss awaits, so Christians should be looking forward to heaven. Faith impacts medical decision-making. So I would think, you put those two things together, I would think that if you are a devout religious person, and I'm not going to go into great detail about what that means, but you might imagine it including seeking divine guidance, asking forgiveness, trusting God to take care of you, and you accept the fact that you are terminally ill, that you have been given a diagnosis that the physicians and medical teams say is terminal and that you have a very limited life expectancy, that you would probably opt for a treatment plan that focuses on relieving pain and discomfort as much as possible, even if that means not living as long. That's what I would think. And I would be wrong. So when I was crafting this talk to give for the provincial lecture a little while back at Loma Linda, I really thought that. I thought, well, how is faith impacting how we make decisions? And I was surprised by the data. And I think that in general, being surprised by the data is a healthy thing because it says to us that we're not wedded to our preconceptions. So that led me to dig. And it came out that there's a lot of data for this. One of the most important articles came out in JAMA some years back. This is from 2009. And it looked at religious coping. Now, religious coping, as we're going to see in a few minutes, can take a positive or a negative slant. But basically, religious coping means that we cope in part or in large part based on our religious beliefs. And this study, which is a multi-site prospective longitudinal study, found that positive religious coping, which is where we find comfort and meaning, in patients with advanced cancer is associated with receipt of intensive, life-prolonging medical care near death. So it didn't lead people to say, no, I don't want that, I'm ready for heaven. It led them to accept intensive, life-prolonging care. So who was part of this study? As I said, it was a multi-institutional prospective study called the Coping with Cancer Study, variety of different institutions spread throughout the country, and it included people who had a diagnosis of advanced cancer with a prognosis of less than 1 year. I don't know where that line came from. All of a sudden, I have a big red line on my screen. So I apologize for that. I did not mean to put that there, and I don't know how that happened. So who are the patients that were looked at? As you can see, wide range. And one thing that is important to note is that since this was a coping with cancer and looking at religious belief, there were a variety of religious beliefs represented: Catholic, Protestant, Baptist, and other. So this is the RCOPE, which is a scale of religious coping. And it talks about both positive religious coping and negative religious coping. Okay, now red lines are magically disappearing from my screen, so I'm grateful for however that's happening. So positive religious coping is what we're really looking at. And these are represented by people who looked for a stronger connection with God, sought God's love and care, sought help, putting plans in God's hands, asking forgiveness. So these are the positive aspects. And we'll come back to the negative ones in a bit. So what did they find? So this is a study that looked at level of positive religious coping, either high or low, and whether or not you got intensive life prolonging measures. And what they found was there was a statistically significant difference in mechanical ventilation, resuscitation, intensive life prolonging care, and death in the ICU that was much higher for people who espoused a high level of positive religious coping. So if you coped in a positive religious way, you were more likely to receive those interventions. Now you might wonder, is there a confounder here for race or ethnicity? As you can see, about the number of patients that they looked at, these are the number of patients who espoused high or low religious coping who were white. As you can see, the majority of white patients actually espoused negative religious coping, whereas the majority of Black and Hispanic patients espouse positive religious coping. So they wondered, is this maybe not a religious coping thing? Maybe this is a race ethnicity thing. So they controlled for that potential confounder. And what they found was that the differences remained statistically significant for both ventilation and intensive life prolonging care. So it was not race and ethnicity that was driving it. Actually, the Balbonis, this husband and wife team who have done such amazing research in this area, argued that it actually worked the other way. They said it is not race or ethnicity primarily driving more aggressive care, but the role of religious values. And in fact, if there is confounding, it works in the opposite direction. So rather than race or ethnicity making religiosity look more important, it's actually religiosity that's making race or ethnicity look more important. So in summary, when they looked at the impact of religious coping, they found that about a third of patients with high religious coping would prefer heroic measures, whereas only about 8% of low religious coping, with a significant odds ratio. So the take-home message is that positive religious copers were about 3 times more likely to receive intensive treatment and about twice as likely to receive ICU care. Now, lest you think that this is one study, so maybe that was just an outlier, or there was a methodological problem, they found that this is not an isolated finding. This has been documented in a variety of other studies. So this is pretty well established in the empirical literature. So this fundamental argument that I thought was so elegant and so compelling, faithful Christians should look forward to heaven, faith impacts medical decision making, so thus devout terminally ill patients should be less likely to request aggressive treatment, actually turns out to be exactly wrong. So devout terminally ill patients, including faithful Christians, are actually more likely to request aggressive treatment in an attempt to prolong earthly life. So why is this important? Well, pain and suffering are frequent at the end of life. We've seen that in a variety of studies over a long period of time. Aggressive end-of-life cancer care is also associated with poor quality of death and more complicated caregiver bereavement adjustment. So the impact of this not only impacts patients, it impacts families as well. So in addition to quality of care, there's also the financial impact. So costs are higher, studies have shown, for patients whose spiritual needs aren't supported, especially minorities and high religious copers. So if you're a high religious coper, you get more treatment, that's going to be more expensive. And actually, some have said that the projected annual savings if patients' spiritual needs are supported is in the order of billions of dollars. So here's our fundamental argument that actually turned everything that I thought on its ear and leads us to question, well, why is that? So anytime we find a surprising empirical finding, we should figure out, well, why is that? What did I reason erroneously? So this is from the Balboni's recent book, and they looked at 4 aspects of religious community spiritual support that led to these outcomes we're seeing: poorer quality of life, increased pain, increased ICU care, increased costs, and they divided it into 4 subsets, and I'm going to add a couple on top of that. The 4 subsets are divine sovereignty, which is it's all up to God. We're going to look at these in more detail in a minute. Miracles, because God can act outside of traditional scientific methods. The sacredness of life, that life is a gift and we should cherish it, and that suffering may be a test from God or maybe an opportunity for us to emulate Jesus in suffering. So let's look at each of those a little bit more in depth. So divine sovereignty, people have argued that only God knows when it is time to die. That's a very, very common belief, especially in the African American community. Clergy in the United States in surveys were theologically sympathetic to patients who said, I'm not going to make a decision, a definitive decision, because ultimately it's in God's hands. Now that's significant because the presumption in modern medicine is that we do everything for everybody unless somebody tells us not to. So we often say in medicine, not making a decision is kind of making a decision. Not refusing something is implicitly accepting it. And also, if physicians are viewed as tools or servants of God, then the patient may have an increased tendency to defer to physician recommendations, which may be towards more intensive treatment. Miracles, there's a lot of examples in the Bible, obviously, of miracles. They're signs of divine favor. A large percentage of respondents in surveys, patients, and especially patients approaching the end of life, may believe that a miracle could occur. They may have an overly optimistic view of their prognosis. 2/3 of the patients in that study I mentioned earlier endorsed a belief that God would heal them through a miracle. And so basically waiting for a miracle is a sign of faith, a belief that God not only could do something, but will do something. Conversely, enrolling in hospice and declining further life prolonging treatment might be viewed as a failure of faith or a lack of faith in what God could conceivably do. The sacredness of life, clearly life is a gift, and so some people want to make sure that they don't give up on God before God has given up on them, quote unquote. That's from Dan Solmesi, who's a former Franciscan friar, bioethicist, and physician. And some believe that a DNAR, a do not attempt resuscitation order, could be even morally wrong because may reflect a lack of honor for the sanctity of life because one is not doing everything possible to sustain or prolong life. On that note, I was going to share a story that will always stick with me. So some years ago, when I was working in Vermont, there was a patient who came to the hospital, a woman in her 40s, who had had a very, very severe stroke. And she was a remarkable woman from all indications. By the time I met her, she was not able to interact with us. And her prognosis for any kind of meaningful recovery was essentially nil. So she was nonverbal, essentially non-responsive, was dependent on artificial nutrition and hydration, although she was able to breathe on her own. And she was a very devout person. She was very active in her faith community, which was an evangelical congregation in New York State, just over Lake Champlain from where we were. And she was actually going back to school to become a nurse in order to work in the developing world in sort of a missionary capacity when she had this stroke just out of the blue. And so I was called in as the ethics consultant because the medical team felt like her prognosis was so poor and they were worried that her family would advocate for overly aggressive treatment. And when I met with her mother and her sister, they were just delightful people. They were not members of her congregation, but they loved her immensely, and they recognized that she had said she wouldn't want to be sustained in that condition. And they said, we just want to take her back closer to home so that we can love her for as long as she has left, and we don't think she would want artificially administered nutrition and hydration. So there really seemed to be no ethical conundrum. She was transferred back to New York State, which has some very specific rules that were just coming into play about who got to make decisions for patients who had not named a durable power of attorney for healthcare. And it was the only time, or one of the only times in my 15 years working in ethics in Vermont, that I had sort of a emergent ethics consult that required me to make a road trip. So I got a call from the local hospital where she had been admitted for end-of-life care. They didn't have a residential hospice, and there was a great deal of angst. And the angst was coming from the fact that her congregation were praying for her, which was great, but they were very, very upset that she was not receiving artificial nutrition and hydration. And to the point where some members of the medical staff, some nurses on night shifts at the hospital, were actually suspected of surreptitiously infusing extra IV fluids to help keep this patient alive. And so, and the pastor of her congregation threatened to go to the news media and say that there's a patient who is vulnerable and is being starved to death at the hospital and all kinds of incendiary things, that I was so worried that it was going to make it even more difficult for the family in the midst of their ongoing grief. So I drove over and met with a wide variety of stakeholders. There's a big meeting with the hospital ethics committee and the physicians and the patient's family and her pastor and some members of her congregation. And I gave what I thought was a very thoughtful description of moral, legal, and religious obligations related to artificial nutrition and hydration. I talked about some of the stuff we were talking about here in terms of what we can expect and what a heavenly promise that is promised in Scripture would reflect. And it went on for quite some time. We had some very thoughtful conversation, and I had a very profound sense that I wasn't getting anywhere. And I was really worried what would happen to this patient and to this family. So near the end, I told them a story, and I kind of flipped it on its ear. So you guys may have heard there's an old joke about a person who was in kind of a shipwreck. His ship sank, and he's treading water, maybe holding on to a piece of flotsam or jetsam, and he's praying to God, God, save me so I don't drown. And another boat comes by and says, hey, looks like you need a lift. Can we give you a ride to the nearest piece of land? And he said, no, I'm good. I'm waiting for God to save me. And they went on. And then a helicopter came over and dropped a line and said, hey, you want to lift because it looks like you're really struggling, and we can help you get to land so you'll be safe. And he says, no, I'm fine. I'm waiting on God to save me. And eventually he just is exhausted and he ends up drowning. And then fast forward, he's in front of the pearly gates and God says, welcome to heaven. And he says, hey, God, thanks very much, but I'm kind of a little bit upset here. Like I'm faithful. I prayed to you. I prayed that you would save me, and you didn't. So what's up with that? And God said, well, who do you think sent the ship, and who do you think sent the helicopter? And I think sometimes we look at it that way, but we don't acknowledge that it can actually be viewed kind of in the reverse for patients approaching the end of life. So I think sometimes patients at the end of life are struggling. They are scared, just like this person in the water was. They might be short of breath, just like this person in the water was. And what God is trying to do at various points is bring us home. And what we end up doing is saying, I don't want to be brought home. I want to go somewhere else. I'm turning down this response to my prayer because it's not the one that I want. And so what I said to this group, I said, I wonder if what's happening here is that by virtue of the stroke, by virtue of the inability to eat, by virtue of the other complications of this patient's care, those are opportunities for God to bring her home. And each time we, as the people now making decisions, are the ones saying, no, we're going to stay right here. And it felt like something changed in the room when I shared that little story. And the pastor and the members of his congregation stepped away, and they took a night to pray about it. And the next day, they let the family know that they still totally disagreed. It's not like anybody's opinion was changed, but they also recognized that doing anything more than expressing their disagreement would probably compound the sorrow the family was experiencing. And she died peacefully some days later. The third of the four things that the Balbonis talk about is suffering as a test or blessing. And many people do sense a religious purpose to suffering. And some would even go further and talk about redemptive suffering and ways that suffering impacts how we view the world and how we view ourselves. So these are a variety of biblical references from the Gospels and some of the other New Testament letters that talk about the benefit of suffering both for oneself, that I may attain resurrection from the dead through suffering as Jesus did, for others, and for the church as a whole. And I would add a couple more. So in addition to the four that the Balbonis talk about, I would talk about the fact that a lot of faithful people are impacted in their decision-making by earthly obligations. And then this is kind of coming back to the title of the talk, to metaphysical concerns. So in terms of earthly obligations, Paul talks about this. I want to be with God, but I have obligations here. There are people I love here. There are people I want to take care of here, whether it's my family or my friends. And this notion of religious community that can be so helpful in preserving meaning and connection in the face of illness may actually prompt, understandably, patients to say, I don't want to leave this group that I care about so much, and maybe I can still contribute to. And then there's metaphysical concerns, which is another way of saying what some people might call doubt. So all of this is predicated on the fact that faithful Christians should go to heaven. And I wonder if part of this, for some people, could be a wondering of, is that going to be me? Do I need to do more? Did I sufficiently respect divine sovereignty? If, maybe if I say no to further treatment, is that kind of turning my back on a miracle? And does that have eternal implications? Am I not suffering in the way that I should, that I'm called to? Have I not done as much on earth as I should have? And so there, it's important to note that while we've been talking about the role of spirituality and decisions on positive religious copers, there are also negative religious copers. Actually, most people who cope religiously have positive and negative impacts. So the positive, if you remember, is talking about feeling welcomed, loved, accepted, turning to God, leaning on God. Well, the negative religious coping is looking at one's illness through a religious lens, but drawing more negative conclusions. Have I been abandoned? Is this punishment? Does God really love me? And I'm going to go back. So if you notice that when you talk about positive religious coping, then many of those people who espouse positive religious coping, a majority of them also talk about negative religious coping. So a lot of us, it's not one or the other. It's not just God loves me, but there's also a sense of, if God loves me, why am I experiencing this? Which kind of reminded me, as I was thinking about this, of the parable of the talents, which may be familiar to most of us. So a rich person says, I'm going away for a while. I'm going to entrust 3 servants with an amount of money, 10 talents, 5 talents, 1 talent. And then I'm going to come back. And the one who had the 10, invested it wisely, made a lot more. And when the rich man came back, he said, you did great. And the one who got 5 didn't invest it quite as wisely or as aggressively, still made some money, and he was welcomed. And then there was the one person, the person who had 1 talent, said, I was scared. I was scared that you would be angry with me if I lost this, so I just buried it. And here it is, it's back. I didn't lose it. And I have to confess that, again, I seem to be surprised a lot in this talk, but as another example of me being surprised, I would have expected, if there's a parallel between the landowner and God or Jesus, for the landowner to say, you don't need to be scared. But in fact, the landowner said, you are wicked and slothful. To everyone who has more will be given, and he will have an abundance, but the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away from him. And cast this worthless servant into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So maybe there are some folks who say, I don't want to be the person like that guy who had the 1 talent and gave up too soon or was too scared. So with that as background, what should we do? Well, one thing we can do is provide more spiritual care. That seems like an obvious one. The interesting piece is that a lot of the outcomes depend on who's providing it. Patients who were well supported by their religious community were more likely to receive aggressive measures and much more likely to die in the ICU. And that was especially true and even worse for high religious copers. So if you are a high religious coper, someone who really looked at the world through religious terms, even in a positive way, if you received the majority of your spiritual support from your home faith community, your odds of receiving a lot of treatment at the end of your life were very, very high. And this is from one of the Balbonis articles. As you can see, when you look at patients who either receive hospice care or have a receipt of aggressive medical interventions at the end of life, high religious copers were much less likely, when they received care through their local faith community, less likely to enroll in hospice and more likely to receive aggressive medical treatment at the end of life. And again, when you look at comparison of spiritual support from the medical system versus religious communities, you see the exact same thing. So hospice care at the end of life, much more likely if you received spiritual support from the medical team than from your home religious community. So why is that? Well, part of it may be clergy who may not have medical training, and understandably may not have much medical familiarity. They could overestimate the capacity for cure. They may not recognize advancing illness or the signs of decline that medically oriented spiritual support structures like hospital chaplains might. There may be lack of understanding. So this was a survey of clergy, local clergy, and they found that only about 60 to 70% really understood what hospice care was. Many people drastically overestimated how frequently CPR works. And they also drastically overestimated the concern for addiction in cancer patients who are being treated for pain. So maybe just lack of understanding. And the conclusion to that article was that local clergy often may take a passive approach to end-of-life care. So they may defer to the patient, they may honor free will, and ultimately they embrace the role of supporting, not questioning, a seriously ill patient's decision to pursue aggressive or comfort-focused care either way. So they're not going to challenge it, they're going to go along with it. And part of that may be their understanding of the source of human dignity. So when they looked at community clergy in a different study, They found 4 things that contributed to either a sense of wholeness, uncertainty, or separation or doubt. One was physical suffering, which can be interpreted in a variety of ways. Either it's bad or it may be emulating Jesus. But another one is dignity, which I think is really important for us to reflect on a little bit. Namely, when I think of dignity in a theological context, I think of the imago Dei, or the image of God in which we're all created. I wonder, though, sometimes if we're reverting more to a notion of human autonomy, that if dignity means you get to make your own decisions, which leads to a much different conclusion. So how do we reconcile all these findings? That a religious community enhances quality of life overall, but that same religious community can diminish quality of life at the end of life. And the Balbonis surmise that these contrasting findings may reflect the fact that religious communities focus on spiritual support in fighting disease may help keep quality of life higher earlier in the course of a disease, but may become increasingly incongruent or even in conflict with what the patient really needs spiritually at the end of life. Spiritual care from the medical team, though, has a different effect. It increases the likelihood of hospice enrollment rather than decreasing it. And the issue here is not so much that there are distinct theological positions. It doesn't mean that there's a theological distinction between medically oriented spiritual support and home parish or home church spiritual support, but rather there's a different interpretation of the patient's context based on an understanding of the medical facts. So some would say that the medical team could help. So if we could do more spiritual support from within the medical context, that could help spare patients unnecessary suffering. One problem with that, though, is availability. So most patients report that there's so much going on in their medical care that spiritual support actually represents a very small portion of it, which makes it more understandable why they would seek that spiritual support from their home parish. So basically, spiritual folks may not know much about medicine, those outside the medical establishment, and medical folks don't spend much time on spirituality. So what could we do? Well, we could expand medical chaplaincy services, like speaking as someone who works in a place where we are drastically underserved from a medical chaplaincy perspective. That's always a good idea. And one that I think is more intriguing is we could equip local clergy to provide spiritual care at the end of life. So how do we do that? So I'm going to look at those 6 areas that the Balbonis talked about and see what we can do differently there, and hopefully have a few minutes at the end for some conversation. So the first is divine sovereignty. So I think sometimes when we talk about divine sovereignty as it's all up to God, so I'm not going to make any decisions, recognizing that not making a decision is actually making a decision. Is it possible that allowing oneself to receive or actually actively seeking aggressive treatment is sort of the equivalent of that drowning person who's like, no, I'm going to keep fighting. I'm going to keep swimming. I'm going to cling to this life, when actually God is saying, I want to bring you home. Faith in miracles is a wonderful thing. One of the things that we train spiritual care providers to do is when someone says, I'm hoping for a miracle, to not just assume that means cure. Miracles come in different forms. And there is also that old saying that God answers every prayer, but sometimes the answer is no. So for us to say that I believe thus God will have to perform a miracle seems to actually reflect, to my mind, a sense of us being able to command God to do what we want. Redemptive suffering, certainly there are those verses I talked about from both the Gospels and the New Testament epistles. At the same time, there are other verses that look towards Christ's sacrifice as being once for all. Jesus certainly had compassion on people and healed them of their ailments. And for everyone who says that we're supposed to take up our cross and follow Jesus, we might refer to Jesus's words in Matthew talking about my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So in that survey of local clergy that I mentioned earlier by Sanders, there was a sense of contrast between seeking and acceptance. So seeking life might be clinging to the hope of a miracle and enduring what might be viewed as redemptive suffering, whereas acceptance is deferring to God's will and hopefully seeking relief from suffering. The sacredness of life, certainly life is a gift from God. At the same time, that means it's all about God. And sometimes I think that we end up confusing the imago Dei and the gift that we've been given with our own sense of human autonomy and our hope for control. Earthly obligations are very important, obviously. At the same time, if we do trust God, then hopefully we can trust God to not only care for us, but also care for those who are most important to us. And the last thing is metaphysical concerns, which was my phrase for doubt earlier. So I wonder if what we really need to do is take that head on and provide a sense of comfort and welcome. So I would hope that the pastoral message is not how much have you done or how much can you endure, but rather in whom you put your trust. And instead of deferring to our often misinformed and inherently fallible sense of human autonomy, I think it would be brave and wonderful if spiritual leaders could talk about what a good death is in the eyes of God, and that talk about Jesus's healing ministry, and talk about Jesus talking about being a home for the outcast, and that it may be time for the suffering patient to be brought home for that thing that we all say we hope for. And I have to confess to my own bias, which is I've always struggled with the parable of the talents. And I wonder if that has an impact on end of life care implicitly. If patients, when they're scared and you live your life in a certain way and you anticipate something, but when you come to the end of a road, of a segment of a road, and you really begin to wonder what happens next, if a more helpful framing is not the parable of the talents, which might instill a sense of fear, but rather one of my favorite parables is the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And you may recall that in that parable, Jesus contrasts the Pharisee who did everything right, gave away his money and lived a faithful life and was devout, and sort of with a sense of pride and maybe not unjustified, walked into the synagogue and said, "Here I am. I've done what you told me to do." And then by contrast, you had the Pharisee who didn't do any of that stuff, probably couldn't even bring himself to look up to heaven and just said, "Have mercy on me because I'm a sinner." And so rather than spiritual care at the end of life, praising somebody for the devout life they led, I wonder if there's a way of reframing that to say that all we need to do is ask for forgiveness and accept the welcome into the kingdom that has been promised in Scripture. And then there's lots of references. As you saw in the first few slides, there is a link to these slides. If anybody wants them, I'm happy to send them out to folks. And I have to say, I'm now going to stop sharing. And I, for whatever reason, could not see the chat box while I was talking. So please don't take my not responding to chat as anything other than I didn't see it until right now, which is really cool. So it looks like we have about 5 minutes left. And so if folks have comments, questions, either in the chat or if people want to unmute, I'm happy to look at that. But I enjoy hearing what you guys think of all that.
Thank you, Dr. Macauley. Thank you, Bob. If you want to give Dr. Macauley a round of applause, you can just go down to the reaction button, and or you can just raise your hands like Peter Bath is doing and give your applause. Thank you. That was so rich. And there are many things that have come in via the chat. A number of them have this flavor to them, Dr. Macauley. Just because we long for eternal life in the kingdom of glory doesn't mean we're not enjoying this particular day. And in fact, maybe we see the current life as a foretaste of heaven, so we're not eager to give up on what we're already experiencing. There were several comments to that effect. So perhaps the premise is wrong. What do you say back?
Well, I appreciate that, and I think that I would totally agree with that. And so and please understand, I'm not saying that someone who's having a lovely cup of tea with their spouse and looking forward to a phone call from their kids and babysitting their grandkids that night and putting them to bed. Like, I'm not talking about folks like that. I'm talking about like that earlier picture of the patient in the ICU with central lines, mechanical ventilation, who is not going to survive. And I think that the foretaste you talk about is very, very important. At the same time, I don't think that we're called upon to endure until the absolute last minute. Like, I don't think we get a prize for you lived as long as you possibly could. I think that there are times where if someone is approaching the end of their life, there are different ways to do it, and there can be a way to do it with mercy.
I have, as I've thought these thoughts before, Bob, I have wondered about the Adventist tradition in a special way, because we tend to valorize long life. We think it has something to do with a lifestyle. And I've wondered at times if on the Adventist team, you don't feel like you let the team down if you die early. You have to go for the record.
Well, you know, Jerry, you and I've had these conversations about was it the blue zone or something like that?
Go.
Like,
Right, there you are.
yeah. So I understand that, and I think that that can be a great gift and a sign of healthy living and faithful living. At the same time, there's a little that strikes me as a little proud, and proud I don't usually use in a good way in this regard. So I think that making sure we view life as a gift is an important thing, and a gift from God that is never going to last forever.
Apropos of the comments about valorizing pain and suffering, Chris Job, who I see in plain sight here, wonders, in that case, why we pad church pews. Thank you, Chris, for that observation. I'm going to remember that one. And so one of the things that has occurred to me, and there's some reference to it here in the comments, has to do with the view of God. You talked about God's sovereignty. And there is kind of almost a fatalism that comes in with some people. You mentioned it in conjunction with vaccination, for example. Usually I wear my seatbelts and get my brakes fixed and so forth. But what about that attitude that God's in charge and I'm just going to relax into that, and whatever happens will? More about that. Is that a positive sign from your point of view of religious coping or not?
Well, I think that there is something to be said for that to some degree, that ultimately I'm not in charge. Like, I view that as a humble way of looking at the world. Like, I can only do what I can do. At the same time, I need to do what I can do. I think we have been entrusted with a sense of responsibility. And when we talk about, love your neighbor as yourself, love isn't just sort of sitting back and having nice thoughts. Like, we are called upon to reach out to those who need us and to impact the world in a good and formative way. So I think that there's an important middle ground to say that it's not all about me, but it's also nothing about me, because I've been entrusted with a responsibility as a faithful person, and I need to figure out how to live that out.
We're coming near the end of the time. Several people have asked in the chat, Dr. Macauley, if you would be willing to share the slides, and I think you've already indicated that you would by putting the link there. If it's okay with you, we will also make those available via the Bioethics Consortium website. And let me just say to those of you who need access to the Adventist Bioethics Consortium website, which is just adventistbioethics.org, simple as that. Let me repeat that, adventistbioethics.org. We will put the slides for Dr. Macaulay's presentation on that website as well. And so thank you, Dr. Macauley. We've come right up to the break time. We applaud you, and we look forward to what you're going to tell us tomorrow. Dr. Macauley will be back with us tomorrow. We have now scheduled a 15-minute break. We've learned that that's kind of useful, but if you want to stay here looking at each other and sending texts back and forth, I saw rather rich conversations going on here. You're welcome to do that as well. We'll be back in just a few minutes for a very important presentation by Mr. Jeff Bromme from AdventHealth on the law and ethics. Time to start our next session, and here to introduce our speaker is Dr. Ted Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton is the Chief Mission Officer for AdventHealth, Mission Integration Officer, and also the Senior Vice President for Mission and Ministry. Ted, please introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jerry. It's a privilege to introduce my friend and colleague, Jeff Bromme. Jeff is a graduate of Southwestern Adventist University and University of Texas Law School. He spent the early part of his career with the prestigious Arnold and Porter law firm in Washington, D.C. Jeff and his wife, Nicole, have 3 young adult children, Max, Juliet, and Leif. Jeff's interests include good music, good literature, good friends, and good conversation. He's a person of deep faith and an excellent sounding board at the interface of faith, ethics, and law. On a side note, Jeff's home is located at the headwaters of the Wekiva River, and his backyard is a favorite wildlife habitat, inviting frequent visits by black bears, deer, and other assorted wild critters. Today, Jeff reflects on issues at the interface of faith-based healthcare, ethics, and the law. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Ted. I can tell that's not a bio that I ever prepared. That's too personalized, but you guys can tell Ted is a good friend of mine, as he is of all of ours. And we've spent many a nice Sabbath afternoon back by that creek, watching out for bears and having those theological discussions that Ted referenced. And Jerry, thank you for inviting me to share with this group today. I look forward to this, and I hope that something that I say might spark some interest. When we think about legal issues in faith-based healthcare, you almost don't have a limiting principle, and that's a challenge. You know, where is the edge of the ethical issues and the legal issues in faith-based healthcare? We see them in so many different places. And so what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is share with you a high-level list of issues that I've encountered in some way, shape, or form, either because we've actually had to deal with the legal issue in our company in the dozen or so years I've been here at some level, or because I have a colleague in faith-based healthcare, one of our other Adventist systems perhaps, or one of our other faith-based partners that provide care in our country to millions of people that have dealt with it. And we'll lay it out and invite discussion and reaction. These are not issues that have tidy conclusions to them, but I think this group is used to that. You guys deal in that gray zone of ambiguity where tidy conclusions are hard to find. Well, with that, let me move to the very first principle. If I can figure out how to do this now, Jerry, I got my screen shared and now I got to figure out how to advance my slide. Hang on, let's see. There we go. I always like to start my legal presentations by saying, do you know who your attorney is? Because sometimes people forget that, and attorneys can actually be helpful in a lot of ways in healthcare that don't always occur to people. Now, thankfully, you, Jerry, and Ted, and others have always been interested in where is the legal intersection with ethics, but it wouldn't obviously be obvious. You might think there could be ethical issues as to which the law would be silent, or the law ought to be silent, and the law ought to stay out of it because it'll get it wrong. And all those things may be true, but my encouragement is that whatever system you all are working for, get to know your attorney, find somebody who can help you, because I will tell you there are times when what our ethical inner moral compass tells us is the right answer that the law has not caught up with, or the law has just not accepted. And you don't want to get too far down the road without paying attention to what our policymakers have reflected in statutes. I'm going to skip this one and come back to it, because I realize that I really ought to start with how we treat our employees, because there will be a natural flow here. So I've divided, I only have about eight slides or so. I've divided this talk into different aspects of engagement that a faith-based health system will have. And one aspect of engagement is in how we treat our employees. And there are at least 4 ways in which it occurred to me that we treat our employees, or 4 spheres in which we treat our employees that are certainly ethical, but have legal intersection. For the last probably 2 or 3 decades, certainly in the last decade, there has been a great deal of change in our culture and in our legal landscape as pertains to sexuality, issues of sexuality, and LGBTQ issues, if you want to use that as sort of an overall umbrella. And I think we are generally familiar with how the law has changed there. And obviously, as the law has changed and as cultural norms have advanced or evolved, there has been an accompanying tension with some interpretations of Christian and other faith expressions, and trying to find the right balance and accommodation has not always been easy, nor has, I'm sure, it always been struck appropriately by the majority. But with that as background, we can remind ourselves of the landmark Supreme Court case from last year, the Bostock decision, in which the Supreme Court, I think it was a 6-3 holding. So this was not a narrowly divided holding. Concluded that Title VII, which is the law that governs how employment decisions can be made and administered, extends not just to the word sex as it might have been understood in 1971-72 when that law was passed, but also extends to homosexuality and transgenderism. So that after the Bostock decision last year, it is illegal under federal law, under Title VII, it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of sexuality, sexual orientation, transgender status. And that decision, I think, probably didn't have a direct impact on most faith-based healthcare systems in this sense. Certainly it did not on ours. We were not, and I don't know of any health system that had as a policy that it would discriminate on those bases. So at one level, one might say that decision did not change anything. Now, if you are a person on the program who is gay or transgender, you might have a completely different perspective, and I respect that. I know that from where I sit, I might have missed that kind of discrimination. But I will say that it has not been the overt known official policy to discriminate on that basis as long as I've been in healthcare. And yet that victory for the expansion of Title VII certainly has altered the landscape in other ways in healthcare that we're still sorting through, and I'll be very specific. One of the questions that has come up after that decision is whether the same understanding of the word sex that the Supreme Court applied in the Title VII case should also apply to other federal statutes where the word is used, including Title IX, for example. And some of you may remember that in the Affordable Care Act, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, there is a non-discrimination provision that forbids any healthcare entity receiving funds through the federal government from discriminating on a variety of bases in the delivery of care, the services they offer, and so forth, on any basis prohibited by, and then it gives you a long list of federal statutes, including Title IX. And so the question has arisen now that if Title VII's use of the word sex has this broader meaning, would it not follow logically that that broader meaning might also apply in Title IX and therefore be imported into the Affordable Care Act through that Section 1557? And that, of course, would have very obvious legal implications for healthcare. So even though the Title VII decision, Bostock, may not in itself have been a landmark in how health systems hopefully were treating their employees, the interpretation and expansion of it well may. The Trump administration was quick to say, their Department of Justice was quick to say that there would be no expansion outside of Title VII of this interpretation. The Biden administration has taken the opposite view and has taken the view that once the Supreme Court now tells us what sex means in Title VII, that's what it means in other statutes. So we are going to have a new legal layer. I think as time evolves, probably the courts will reach the same decision the Biden administration has, and we're going to see this word sex take the Bostock meaning wherever it is used. Now, I'll come in a minute to how that affects our treatment of patients. Right now, I'm just focused on employees. Obviously, how we treat each other is an ethical issue, and here's a perfect example of where the law has put a very, very obvious oar in the water. A current issue where we see this, and I won't dwell too much on this, is the current debate in Congress over the Equality Act. If you've been following this, you know the House passed the Equality Act quite clearly. I think it was mostly a partisan vote, but the Democrats had the majority, and it passed, and it's in the Senate. I understand that Senate passage is viewed as somewhat challenging. One of the objections to the Equality Act is that it does not have a clear religious exemption, but the Equality Act would do exactly what I described in taking the Title VII ruling and applying it through a number of other civil rights statutes, including Title IX. There is a competing piece of legislation, the Fairness for All Act. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has voiced its support for that second piece of legislation, which prohibits discrimination against the LGBTQ community, but has a religious exemption. So we're going to continue to see more at this intersection of employee rights and the law. It's the question I would leave you with on this first bullet is just a thought question, which is this: what is the ethical stance for a faith-based healthcare company to take? Is it to do exactly as much as the law requires and nothing more? Or is it to find ways to go beyond the law in this area? I don't ask the question by way of suggesting an outcome. I leave that to your perspectives and conscience. But this is a live issue in our employee relations departments now, I think, as companies determine, in a world in which we are embracing diversity in our workforce and celebrating it and upholding it as an important workplace value. Is it possible to celebrate diversity in all of its manifestations consistent with the sponsoring organization tenets of various faith-based institutions? A thought question for you. Another area where we can see ethical and legal issues is in the question of Sabbath accommodation. Occasionally this comes up in our company, which of course is sponsored by or affiliated with the Adventist Church. As many of you are members, you understand the Sabbatarian convictions of that denomination. And occasionally we have Seventh-day Adventist employees who want to not work on Sabbath. And the question comes, do they get special dispensation? Should we be more accommodating for Adventist employees who don't work on Sabbath? Should we be less? Christ healed on the Sabbath. How do we deal with the question of Sabbath accommodation as an ethical question with our workforce? If we don't accommodate them on a particular day, what are we doing to accommodate the principle of rest? There's a ethical issue. Or are we willing to let our doctors work as hard as they want to, as long as they can make us a good profit, and we're indifferent to whether they ever get any rest, regardless of what day they're on? That's not particularly a legal issue. That last was more of a management issue, but you do see the intersection here. We occasionally encounter employees who are not very open to prayer. I think Ted Hamilton could probably tell stories about helping employees understand how to pray. Employees work for a faith-based organization, and many of them rejoice at the opportunity to express their faith in the workplace and just want to do that. Others don't know how to pray. And how do you approach that subject consistent with law without providing the resources they need, but while respecting their religious distinctiveness and independence. We had a case in our company several years ago brought by an employee who did not like the morning huddle. His supervisor would bring people together and they'd have prayer at the start of the shift. And this offended him, and he was given the opportunity to step out, but that made him feel too conspicuous. And an attempt was made eventually to sort of water down the prayer, so maybe it would just be some inspirational quotes from leading thinkers, and that didn't satisfy this particular individual. Eventually, he brought a claim against us for religious discrimination. But it illustrates that, and many other cases like it illustrate the challenge of accommodating employees who are not particularly faith convicted, but nevertheless work in our companies. The fourth area that I put here in the treatment of employees category is the question of labor unions. I heard this morning from a colleague who had checked the NLRB website that in the last few weeks, 50 petitions for union organizing have been filed with NLRB. I don't know if that's true. I'm just repeating hearsay, which I probably shouldn't do, but I do know this, and we all know this, that in a pandemic world where our workforces are extremely stressed and are performing heroic endeavors for probably not enough pay, the opportunity for labor unions to speak into that and gain members is as strong as it's ever been. And what is the ethical stance that we would take in that area? Is it ethical for a healthcare system to work to undermine labor laws and rules that would make it easier for employees to organize? Or should we be ethically assisting employees to organize? In the case of our company, the Adventist Church has teachings on the subject of labor unions, which have been understood for many years to strongly discourage members from joining labor unions and to avoid institutions from becoming unionized. And I'm not going to unpack all the reasons for that. They go to the question of the perceived question in early Adventist history of individual conscience, the right of each person to decide what they should do. And whether or not one agrees with the teaching, it's a teaching that we as a company have felt like we had to honor. And so when we are confronted with union organizing attempts, we seek to defeat them. But it's an interesting issue, and it's on the front burner now because of the environment that we're in. And there is another piece of legislation, the PRO Act, which is pending in Congress, that would greatly facilitate the organizing of the workforce into labor unions. And so I think that this is also a piece of legislation that we're going to be watching. I know the position I take as a lawyer for a company. I have a client with a perspective that I respect and honor, but you still have to recognize that these perspectives create ethical questions. All right, I wanted just to lay that groundwork and then move backwards now to see how does this affect the treatment of patients. One area where we see an intersection of ethics and patient treatment is patients who are racists. I use that as a shorthand without trying to judge their character, but I think all of us in healthcare understand that there are patients that come into our facilities and they leave none of their biases behind. And when they come into a bed in our facility, they've got distinct ideas of who they think should be taking care of them and touching them. And some of those stories are heartbreaking when you hear about them. I put up here the name of this novel that I read last summer because I was talking about this with a friend of mine last year, and she said, "Oh, you need to read this book." And so I'm not an expert on the problem, but if you want, you may want to pull that book down. I thought it was a very interesting story about a white supremacist who did not want an African-American nurse and the ways in which that experience changed and tried the nurse, her family, and frankly, eventually the supremacist family. And it was just sort of a real life story narrative description of the dilemma. However, the law is pretty clear on this. If you take an employee out of patient care based on their race, even in accommodating a patient request, you have violated Title VII, the law that I mentioned a moment ago. You've committed a discriminatory employment practice on the basis of race. It isn't an excuse for you to say, well, the patient didn't want a caregiver of that race and background. It comes up, but we ought to be able to give a clear answer to that question. Find some way to deal with the patient other than placing the burden of that awful rejection on our workforce. The second bullet point is a developing area that flows out of the Title VII decision I mentioned a minute ago. Now, I think that Jerry and Ted and maybe others are going to be talking a little later in this conference about some specific thought that's been put around this in our Adventist Health Policy Association. I'm not going to get into that, therefore. I'm going to let them explain some principles that they've been working on that I think are excellent. I'm going to just stay focused right here on the law. So one of the questions that comes up, going back to my earlier discussion, if Title IX and the federal laws that are referenced in the Affordable Care Act's non-discrimination provision are construed to include transgender and sexuality, then you have a very clear legal basis for saying that any discrimination in patient care on that basis would not only be wrong, it would be illegal. This comes up through the years. It's come up more frequently in recent years. Often it comes up with the question of name choice. A patient wants to be called by a certain name, reflecting the gender that they are affirming or that they've transitioned to. And the caregiver looks at the official government record for the patient and observes a different name, maybe the name hasn't been legally changed yet, and insists on using the current name and not the name the patient asks. That can sometimes lead to a litigation. Patients cite that as examples of discriminatory treatment and humiliation. So it comes up with name choices. You watch out for that as a source of potential stress and conflict. Another way it comes up is in the question of gender choice. What gender will you refer to the person as when that reference becomes necessary? And sometimes it does in the medical record. We had a question some time ago with respect to a particular EMR program that was in play as to whether there was any ethical reason that we could not allow a third category. There was male, female, and then a third category. Some of you may know the record system I'm talking about, may have dealt with this. And Ted and I and others, we took counsel. We didn't want to give a hasty answer to that, but we concluded that there was no ethical or religious or faith-based tenet from our sponsoring organization that would require us to reject use of that particular EMR, even though it acknowledged a gender category other than male or female. But it comes up there. Another way it comes up is in room selection in non-private rooms. A person who's in the midst of a gender transition wants to be in a room of the gender to which they're headed. I'm not a clinician. I apologize if I'm not speaking in the right terms here, but the roommate in that room may not want to be in a room with somebody who's in a transition, and so you get confronted with the ethical issues there. There's been some litigation over the provision of services, hysterectomies, for example. Recent case involved a transgender male who had sued I think a Catholic system that had not been willing to give a hysterectomy, and I think you'll have the same thing with respect to other procedures. There are issues in this space about insurance coverage. Will an employer's coverage provide benefits for gender transition services? I would say that the trend is yes, and yet it hasn't been immediate. And is it illegal not to? And probably if it's not, it will. That's where the trend is going. So the question of transgender care is manifested in a number of legal environments and issues that intersect with the fundamental ethical question of how do we treat one another, and how do we extend the healing ministry of Christ to one another. The law gives us some rules to follow. I will just say in closing on this particular topic that there is a recent case. It's somewhat interesting. It's a case brought in North Dakota, of all places. I assume because the plaintiffs thought they might find a very sympathetic federal judge in North Dakota. I don't know if that's the reason, but it's an odd place for a challenge to be brought to a significant federal interpretation. And sometimes plaintiffs hunt around until they can find a friendly court. In this case, it's a pending case. It was brought by a coalition of Catholic affiliated systems, arguing that to require them to provide insurance coverage for gender transition services or medical services to transgender patients, like a hysterectomy, violated the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, so that the lawsuit said any construction of this anti-discrimination provision of the Affordable Care Act that would impose monetary penalties on our systems for failing to provide these services would violate another law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a law that allows there to be certain religious exemptions from otherwise applicable federal law. I'm not going to give you a long talk on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, but I will say that it's an increasingly controversial law itself in some quarters. It goes back to the Clinton administration. I don't know whether it would pass today, but it passed then, and it has some exemptions for religious belief. And the court in that North Dakota federal court agreed with the plaintiffs and enjoined the application of any interpretation that would be construed to require these faith-based health systems to provide services inconsistent with their faith. So on that one, I think you just have to stay tuned, because that area of the law is under rapid development. All right, the rest of these slides will go a bit more quickly. I am mindful of the time here. An obvious place when you think about the intersection between ethics and law is end of life, beginning of life issues. I am not going to spend time on the clinical aspects of these issues. Again, I think that's probably covered elsewhere in your conference or has been in the past. I just want to note a couple of things that will be of interest to you. First of all, there is a very intentional effort across some of the states in the country to pass laws that probably are inconsistent with the line of cases that began with Roe versus Wade in the Supreme Court. And part of the strategy by proponents of these anti-abortion laws is to create a case that the Supreme Court would take and rethink that line of cases. Are there enough conservative justices on the Supreme Court that outcome could be revisited or changed or overturned? And so there is a series of these state laws, one of which, interestingly, and I was a little bit surprised by this, but just a couple weeks ago, one of these laws was actually upheld by the Sixth Circuit. It's a law that I think it was an Ohio law. Could have that wrong. I should have remembered that, but it imposed an abortion restriction on a physician who knows that the reason the woman wants the abortion is to abort a Down's syndrome fetus. If the doctor doesn't know that, then there's no problem. So the issue is a question of what the woman tells the doctor and what the doctor knows at the time of the procedure. And it drew the attention of the entire Sixth Circuit. Most Court of Appeals cases are decided by 3-judge panels, but if the whole court wants to take it, which would be, depending on the court, 8, 10, 12, 15 judges, they can take it what's called en banc. And the Sixth Circuit took this en banc. So there's quite a few decisions. The judges didn't totally agree with each other, but there's a significant dissent. And the question in the case, or at least a core question, is when the Supreme Court said that abortion was constitutionally permitted up to the point of viability, did that mean that before the point of viability, you could abort for any reason? And as I read the Sixth Circuit decision, they said, no, if you abort for the wrong reason, viability is not really the question. And aborting a Downs fetus would be the wrong reason. So this might well be a case that ends up at the Supreme Court, because it really does test the limits of where the boundaries of what the court has considered to be constitutional practices are. We will just have to watch. The point is, I think for most of us, my guess is that there are very few abortions done in our facilities. This is probably not standing on our toes, but the law is evolving, and I wanted to alert you to it. And lastly, I wanted just to mention one other thing that is a potential source of risk here for our caregivers. In Florida, we recently discovered that the third trimester is defined as beginning at the 24th week. And abortions in Florida are not permitted in the third trimester. And so you could imagine a circumstance where you might have a woman who has waited maybe too long, but whatever, has a non-viable fetus, a fetus that could be aborted consistent with church teachings, at least in the Adventist church, but would be past that defined point of viability under Florida law, which is not based on clinical evidence. The clinicians would use 26 or 27 weeks, is my understanding, for the beginning of the third trimester. So if you were an unsuspecting clinician, based on your medical treatment, and you understood you didn't want to do an abortion in the third trimester, you would have been wrong, because Florida told you that it started at 24 weeks. So I revert to what I said at the beginning, which is, do you know who your lawyer is? And I don't know whether Florida is unique in this regard. I just happen to know more about it because that's where our headquarters are. It's always worth checking state law when you get into these difficult end of life and beginning of life questions. Speaking of difficult end of life questions, there is interesting litigation in Colorado here on the end of life question. In that case, there's a health system with an employed physician that was subject to the Catholic ERDs that don't permit any assistance to a patient that is seeking to end their life. But in this case, both the patient and the physician said they wanted to. The patient wanted assistance. It's legal in Colorado to give the kind of assistance that was at stake here. In fact, there's the statute there, the Colorado end of life statute. And the case presented an intersection between state law, which was very friendly to this type of medical assistance, if you will, private contract, which was not, an employment contract was not, and the teachings of a faith, which were reflected in the contract. So who wins in that case? Is the employment contract going to win? Is the state law that says the doctor can help going to win? Is the faith teaching going to win? The answer is the case is still pending. We don't have an answer in that case yet. But it is an interesting situation in which an employee would sign a contract saying that they understand the rules that they are working within and will obey them, but then brings a lawsuit when they've changed their mind against the employer, who, I'm showing my bias now. This isn't my company, but I'm showing my bias. I think the employer did all they could to let the employee know who they were working for and what the rules were, what the faith tenets were that would apply, and yet they found themselves in litigation. you might not have expected that if you were the employer. All right, a couple more, and then I'm going to pause and see what questions or reaction there might be. I think vaccination is an interesting ethical issue with some legal overlays now. We're all struggling, I suspect, in our health systems to improve the percent of employees who are vaccinated. And we have here an intersection between what is an employee's autonomous right to decide what kind of treatment to take versus what is the health system's right to insist on certain levels of protection in patient care setting. We have timing issues. There's perspectives here that should you ever mandate a vaccine? If you do, would you wait until the FDA gives approval as opposed through the emergency use authorization, which is how the vaccines have gotten on the market today? What kind of exemptions? I think the law is pretty clear that if we get to the point of mandating vaccines, there will have to be an exemption for religious beliefs. There are HR departments, I think, that don't want to get in the business of trying to figure out what is a religious belief, and they'll give an exemption for a strongly held personal conviction, whatever that is. And so have you created a huge gaping hole in a vaccination program if you go beyond religion to personal convictions? And then, of course, there was a fair amount of press a few weeks ago with questions being raised about whether certain vaccine technologies had inappropriately used stem cells, fetal tissue from years ago. And I think in the Catholic Church there were some pronouncements about when would it be all right to get a vaccine that had its origins. In the case of our company, there was a fact sheet prepared by our clinical team that described the ways the different vaccines had been made, how they had and had not used embryonic stem cells in their development and testing, and that was distributed so the questions could be answered. So here we're going to see some interesting ethical questions about patient care and safety, employee care and safety, and the law's limits on what you can and can't do by way of encouraging or requiring vaccination. And I think this is my last point here. No, I got two more slides. This one and one more. This is just more of a thought question. You know, Mike Griffin, who I see on the phone, my colleague, Carlyle, Walton, and our team in our community engagement group, we spend a lot of time asking ourselves, what does the Lord require of us? We don't put it quite that loftily, but that's really what it is. What is the obligation of a healthcare system to its community? We all are challenged by that. Do our faith perspectives help us understand the legal requirements that we have under tax law to record and keep track of and provide benefits to our communities? In some states, to earn our tax exempt status in various aspects. There's increasing state laws about this that we're dealing with. And of course, there's a continued controversy over 340B funds. Are they for the patient or are they for the hospital? And how do our faith-based ethical frameworks help us make those kinds of decisions, which have a legal overtone as well? And the last slide, this really is the last slide. I'll end with this one, Jerry, because that'll give us 5 minutes here in case anyone's got a question or reaction, is religious preferences in hiring. I'm sure it differs from system to system, but I think that there are systems where being of a particular faith would be required at certain very senior positions. I think that might be true for chaplains, depending on the status of chaplains. I understand that in many Catholic systems, there may not be a religious preference, but you have to have an adherence, a commitment to the ERDs. So what does the law tell us about requiring a leader or a spiritual leader to embrace a particular perspective in order to hold their job within that system? Well, the law has quite a lot to say about that, but I'll leave it there because I want to leave time. But the point is, here we have an ethical question that goes to the autonomy of a person, the freedom of conscience, the individual right to choose, and yet in an organization, where can that organization place its expectations in these very sensitive and private matters of faith? So that's just a potpourri of some of the issues where we see the law and ethics intersect, Jerry, and I'll pause there and hope that somebody has something to challenge me on, maybe disagree. I'd love a little disagreement.
Well, there have been quite a few comments and questions come in. Ted, I don't know if you want to, if you fielded any of those and want to send them Jeff's way, or you'd like for me to do that?
Go ahead, Jerry.
Well, one of the questions that's come in that relates to one of your last slides, Jeff, does a private company or organization give up its religious exemption or its religious rights if it does accommodate people who are diverse? And at what point would you lose the religious exemption?
Well, that's a pretty general question, but I can try to respond this way. Where a company is relying on a religious faith or teaching for a particular practice, it needs to do two things. Well, three things. First of all, it has to recognize it might lose the case. But secondly, it needs to be sure that it's only applying that to the minimal extent needed. For example, let's take this question of leadership. If you were to say, if I were running a Lutheran health system and the Lutheran Missouri Synod told me you must have Lutheran leadership, I would want to be sure that I only had that requirement in places where ministry and mission and identity were present. If I started requiring that for the person who's emptying the trash, I don't mean to pick the other end of the spectrum, but you know what I mean. You have to be targeted. You have to be careful not to go beyond the religious needs. And then the second thing you need to do is be consistent. If you start changing the rules internally, a court will say it wasn't that important to you to begin with. So I'd offer those as two responses to that question, Jerry.
Another question that I have heard, be interested in your response. To what extent is there jeopardy if the church's official statements seem to be different from what the organization that's sponsored by that church and bears the name, in this case Adventist, if that organization seems to have a different approach? I'm thinking of cases I've seen in higher education where that seemed to be a problem for keeping religious exemption. Do you see that in the healthcare area?
Well, I would say that very generally, the courts have not been deeply interested in parsing through theological fidelity, questions of theological fidelity. Does Adventist health actually properly embody and express Seventh-day Adventist teachings? And let us figure out where the variation is. Courts really do not feel well equipped to do that. So generally, courts have been more deferential to an organization that asserts a religious position without questioning its good faith or whether it's totally consistent with its sponsor. There could be lots of play in the joints on that, Jerry, but directionally, that I think I'm comfortable with that.
One last question, born of curiosity from one person, and I share the curiosity. What was the outcome of the lawsuit regarding not wanting to be in a huddle that involved prayer? Did you win or lose? We
didn't try it. We settled it.
Oh, you did. Okay.
Yeah, we didn't feel like we had done anything wrong, but at some point, a lot of these employment cases, I'm being very practical now, the value of the litigation far exceeds the risk. And don't tell anybody. I don't want everyone now suing me on employment cases, but we often settle them.
Honest answer. Thank you, Jeff. I think all of us should applaud Mr. Bromme for such a wide-ranging and informative conversation. Thank you very much, Jeff. We'll have another break of about 15 minutes, and we'll start in again at 15 minutes after the hour. If you're on the East Coast, that'll be 3:15. Out here on the left coast, it's 12:15 noon. See you then.
Thank you. That's a favorite trick, is tell somebody to speak and then keep them muted so you can't say anything. So, well, it's a privilege to welcome you all back, and appreciated being able to plug into some of this, some great discussions going forward. You know, as I've watched the issue of bioethics in the church, and particularly Christian bioethics, I've been pleased with the way that the system has come together and collaborated. And kudos to my colleague and friend Jerry for, I think, many times leading this and pulling us together through some very difficult issues. And I think we can all be proud of what the church's stance has taken on a number of positions through the last 15, 20 years. And I've been the privilege to be part of a few of those, but trying to articulate an Adventist Christian perspective is not an easy task with a church as diverse as we have. Maybe 5, 6 years ago now, we started APA, Adventist Health Policy Association, to try to more clearly unify the sense of the health systems that we have across the country. And that gives us, those of us who serve as CEOs of the systems, to come together twice a year, compare notes and talk about things. And that's taken another step forward a couple of years ago now, with the appointment of Carlyle Walton to be the head of APA, based in Washington, to be our voice to the government, to the country, as we try to articulate these positions. So I'm particularly pleased this afternoon to have Jerry and Carlyle together to talk about this issue and to explain a little bit more of the structure. So in parallel to APA, more recently has been created ABC, Adventist Bioethics Consortium, and a linked effort to truly face together bioethical concerns. And Jerry's providing the leadership for that at this point in time. As you can notice from the color of his beard, Jerry is aging, as are many of us. So he's going to be transitioning some in his work here at Loma Linda, but I'm pleased that he's willing to carry on with ABC and provide leadership for this on into the future. So it's a delight to have Carlyle and Jerry kind of walk us through the structure and the function of what we have and how we hope it can continue to serve the church as a whole. So Carlyle, over to you. And you may need to unmute him as well. I think you've got that thing locked down, Jerry.
Hang on just a second, Carlyle, and we'll check.
I've got it. I'm now unmuted.
Okay,
Thank you.
good.
Appreciate that. And thank you, Dr. Hart, for that very gracious introduction and for your ongoing friendship and your wisdom. And I've also had the privilege of a growing friendship with Dr. Winslow. And today I'm presenting from my office that is located 1 block from the Capitol in the Hall of States building. Some of the tenants we share this building with may be familiar to you: C-SPAN, NBC News, Fox News, and my friend PJ would especially appreciate this, the Kettering Foundation. We literally are housed on the same floor. And I'd like to say thank you to my executive assistant, Kayla Bias, who was very instrumental in making this presentation a reality. And for about the next 10 minutes, as Dr. Hart mentioned, I will share a brief overview of APA's journey over the past 2 years. On Thursday, November the 1st, 2018, with the support of Kayla, my executive assistant, and Dr. Helen Jung, our senior policy analyst, I was privileged to launch the first Washington, D.C. office of the Adventist Health Policy Association, the united policy voice of the 5 seventh-day Adventist health systems ministering in the United States of America. And collectively, we comprise the largest Protestant healthcare system in our nation, serving in 16 states and the District of Columbia, with over 150,000 team members on 94 hospital campuses and hundreds of affiliated care sites. In the fall of 2015, under the leadership of Rich Morrison, who was AHPA's first president, and as a precursor to the 2016 US presidential election, AHPA released its policy agenda to be considered by the next president and Congress of the United States, titled 5 Steps to Health in America. This well-researched collaborative document that was developed with input from subject matter experts from all of our member systems was personally delivered. Dr. Winslow made a few of those visits himself to Capitol Hill by AHPA system leaders to members of Congress representing AHPA states and communities served by our hospitals and affiliated facilities. In 2016 and 2017, the AHPA board engaged in a period of evaluation and reflection on how to best position AHPA for sustained success and impact as a recognized national voice for healthcare transformation. This period of pause resulted in a lack of intended follow-up in working with the new administration, Congress, and interested partners in actualizing this policy agenda outlined in 5 steps. With our arrival in DC in the fall of 2018, November the 1st to be exact, as I visited with and reintroduced AHPA to members of our congressional delegation and advocacy partners, our policy agenda shared in 5 steps was the constant that they remembered about AHPA, requesting follow-up to address our recommendations. Therefore, one of our areas of focus has been to update and reissue a second edition of 5 steps for our new president and Congress. Upon release of the second edition later this month, each attendee of this conference will be receiving via email a copy of the executive summary new to this second edition that will be shared with leaders from the local to the federal level, with a cover letter from the appropriate system CEO, reintroducing AHPA, our policy agenda, and access to the fully digital book that will be on our website. I encourage each of you to visit our website. It's simply AdventistHealthPolicy.org, and explore the digital book that will also be available, as I said, later this month. 40 implementable recommendations are shared within the 5 steps that will become the springboard for practical conversations with locally and nationally elected officials and partners. We will focus on working with our partners, translate these practical conversations into collaborative action, and also the development of federal legislative language to address the recommendations in our policy agenda. This Thursday, the AHPA board will also dedicate focused time to learn more about Adventist Health's Wellbeing Division and their establishment of a Wellbeing Institute to be utilized as one of the learning centers and clearinghouses for our recommendations. Since our arrival in DC, we have focused on reinvigorating AHPA as a trusted, faith-based voice and collaborator in national healthcare and in the transformation of national healthcare by developing ongoing relationships with organizations such as the American Hospital Association, Ascension Health, Premier Inc., and the Healthcare Leadership Council, considered by many as the premier national multi-sector healthcare policy and advocacy association. Recently, Mike Griffin, who is also attending this event, he's AdventHealth's Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Public Policy, was one of the 4 featured speakers at the Healthcare Leadership Council's nationally sponsored webinar on healthcare provider initiatives on quality of life improvements. Mike artfully shared the community work AdventHealth has done and is doing in addressing the social determinants of health in Manchester, Kentucky, rated as the poorest county in our nation in a recent New York Times article. Mike also outlined and shared the profound impact of spiritual care in the outpatient setting, an initiative launched in 2017 by AdventHealth that has literally touched millions of patients. Mike will tell you that he received many inquiries from participants in that webinar, especially wanting to learn more about spiritual care in the outpatient setting. As our federal footprint becomes more indelible, AHPA continues to receive invitations to participate in national coalitions, such as the one on the screen, the Partnership for the Advancement of Virtual Care, a growing, again, multi-sector collaboration of national organizations focused on building on the unprecedented advances in telehealth delivery that occurred as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Just last week, I received an invitation to participate as one of the keynote speakers on health policy at a multi-day educational event of the Leadership Institute, a 65-member organization of leading healthcare providers in the nation. AHPA's biweekly federal policy briefs, prepared by our policy team and issued every other Friday, has experienced growing readership in the past 2 years as we seek to educate and engage internal and external stakeholders. Cherie Danielson on our policy team, who leads this effort, is also participating in this bioethics conference. We invite you to join our community by, again, visiting our website. Building stronger relationships with advocacy leaders at the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. I see my good friend, Dr. Peter Landless, is on. The North American Division, our good friend, Dr. Angie Brewer, is also on. And ADRA has also been a priority. Right now, and I may be stealing some of Angie's thunder here, but AHPA leaders are active participants in an administratively appointed North American Division Task Force, chaired by Dr. Kiyoshin An, to develop resources to address vaccine education and hesitancy within the North American Division membership and our friends. Our current focus is the planning and execution of an interactive symposium for the North American Division on vaccine education and efficacy, featuring national and international subject matter experts. We also work together to ensure the protections we are afforded under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, referenced by Jeff in his earlier talk, that these freedoms are maintained and not assailed. Now, working collaboratively with the Adventist Bioethics Consortium also has been an area of focus in the development of thoughtful guidelines to address issues faced by our systems. And Dr. Winslow will explore further when he speaks one of these issues. We also co-sponsor relevant topics, such as you can see on the screen, our most recent virtual event on racial justice and health equity, featuring AdventHealth's Chief Health Equity Officer, Dr. Ulrich Simmons, and Kettering Health Network's Chief Inclusion Officer, Dr. Josefar Montes. ABC is currently leading an AHPA project commissioned by our board at the last board meeting to develop a statement of commitment on racial justice and equity that will be nationally shared on behalf of our 5 member systems. Every system CEO has assigned a senior member of their leadership team to assist in the development of this document in conjunction with the creation of a living inventory of initiatives being pursued by each of our systems in these areas. The first draft has been completed. I think it was draft number 7, Jerry, that ended up being the final draft. And this work will be presented to the upper board this Thursday during our upcoming board meeting. APA's mission statement, adopted by our board in February of 2019 and emblazoned on our modernized website, which I referenced earlier, AdventistHealthPolicy.org, which I encourage each of you to visit, is promoting wholeness to live God's healing love. Our mission captures the DNA of our 5 member systems. And in every interaction, we seek to answer this question, even though Jeff said earlier, we do not say it as loftily as this is, but this drives every interaction. And that is, what does God require of us? On June the 2nd, 2020, over 500 individuals associated with one of our member systems, Loma Linda University Health, participated in a highly diverse, peaceful demonstration on the university campus that included leaders, staff, faculty, and students. The demonstration included the attendees kneeling in silence for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, which we have since learned was really 9 minutes and 29 seconds, a painful and deadly snapshot in time. The facilitator for this session, my friend Dr. Hart, wrote on June the 1st, 2020 in a memo to the Loma Linda family. He said, I quote, "To see a plea for breath and life itself from George Floyd and a long line before him is painful to watch. That this occurred by a member of law enforcement makes this an injustice even more heartbreaking," end quote. I saw a picture of that demonstration and a sign quietly held with a quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu that has been a propulsive force in my life and leadership and will forever be emblazoned in my consciousness. You see the sign on the screen. It simply says, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. APA has chosen not to be neutral as we engage in national healthcare transformation. We crave your continued prayers as we embrace our mission, our why, of promoting wholeness to live God's healing love. Dr. Winslow, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carlyle. It was very helpful, and we'll take just a moment to shift screens here. And let me just, during that time, if you're willing, you may consider questions or comments that you would like to put there in the chat, and we'll try to get to those. I hope you're seeing the appropriate screen. So yes, this is the 5th annual Bioethics Conference, but it's not annual. Once again, we missed last year. We're looking forward to getting back on track next year, and I hope you'll watch your email and other forms of media so that you can be on the lookout for that conference. Here is a listing of the current participating organizations in the Adventist Bioethics Consortium. Our newest member, Andrews University. I see some of you from Andrews here today. Thank you for joining us. We also have 2 international organizations, one in Peru, also in Australia, and then all 5 of the systems here in the United States that bear the name Adventist or are connected to the Adventist Church. 2020 was, of course, a most unusual year. It started for the Bioethics Consortium rather normally. We had a wonderful presentation by Jay Perez in January, but that was about the time we began to learn that we were headed to trouble and that we were going to have to cancel our May meeting. So we began to address the ethical issues that were arising because of the pandemic. This one on pandemic triage, one of 2 or 3 that we did on this topic. and we began to share ideas and documents. We did have some fall sessions where we were able to have what amounted to flash talks or something like TED Talks to pick up some of the topics that we were not able to present in the May conference that was postponed. Then in December, we had a session, a webinar for leaders on the very sensitive topic of triage when it comes to hospital systems making collaborative decisions about who receives the life-saving benefits and when there's a dire scarcity. Since Carlyle already mentioned this one, I will just say that this webinar and all of our webinars are available under resources at AdventistBioethics.org. So you're encouraged to go there and take a look. And most recently, we have been working on developing shared ethical guidelines. I like to think of these as principled consensus statements. And the first one that we were asked to address was actually the treatment of transgender persons. I want to just elevate that as an example of our collaborative work together. And then we can talk about other possibilities on into the future, including the one that Carlyle just mentioned about health equity and racial justice. But if you want to see the guidelines that we're developing, including the ones on the care of transgender patients, you can go to the website, AdventistBioethics.org. You can create your own account there, password protected, and you'll find guidelines. And under the guidelines, there's now a section that refers to what we're calling the APA guidelines. These are really owned by the Adventist Health Policy Association and developed in collaboration with all of us who participate in the Bioethics Consortium. The process we followed is to gather as much information as we could that would provide us an understanding of the issue, look at evidence-based approaches, set forth principles that we think are consonant with our faith, and do so while listening, in this case, to transgender persons. That point is a very important one to me because I remember the phrase that you've probably heard too, nothing about us without us. And we want to avoid developing things that don't reflect the actual lived experience of the people. So this document was developed and then presented to the APA board, and it was approved in 2020. And now we're going about the process of sharing that consensus statement, including right now. It's again available there under the resources or guidelines section of the website. I won't try to read the whole document to you. It's only 2 pages, but we won't take the time for that. We certainly do welcome questions or comments about it, but we're talking about something that affects about 1.5 million of our fellow citizens. Percentage-wise, you may say that's a low number, but it's a very important number because all of these lives matter to all of us, and they do come to us for healthcare. We are not trying to write policy statements for the health systems. All of you who have been in executive leadership know that that's the responsibility of each organization and approved by their respective boards. What we are trying to do is offer thoughtful guidance that might be useful in the development of those policies. Here are the 10 principles summarized as briefly as I could. Now, every word in these principles, if you read them, has been chosen rather carefully and gone over repeatedly. So I can't possibly do justice to them in just these few brief words, but let me talk about these and comment on them ever so briefly, and then we can get to your comments and questions. Naturally, we are affirming our commitment to provide compassionate, unbiased care that preserves patient autonomy and dignity. Secondly, we want to understand the complex development of gender identity. The more I've learned about this from people who are experts in the field, the more I realize this is a complicated matter. Third, we want to avoid unfounded assumptions about gender identity and sexual orientation, something I've also needed to learn about. Fourth, follow professionally established standards of clinical treatment. Rather than making it up ourselves on the fly, we want to find out what the best expertise has to offer for evidence-based approaches to clinical treatment. And follow that, knowing that we're in a field that is growing with new evidence all the time, so that we're prepared to adjust based on the evidence. Jeff Bromme spoke earlier about a challenging area, and that is arranging facilities that are appropriate for gender identity. Most of us don't have the luxury of endless additional facilities, so this can be a challenge, but we want to try to do the very best we can to ensure that the facilities are arranged in a way that respects the gender identity. Number 7 turns out to be more important to people who identify as transgender than I would earlier have realized. And that is, when they show up for care, sometimes they encounter the attitude that, well, we can't take care of your upper respiratory infection because we don't specialize in treating transgender patients, when what they really need is just basic health care. And that turned out to be an area of real concern. Number 8 as well, consult with experts before altering ongoing specialized therapy. People who are going through transition have entered into a process of treatment that can sometimes be interrupted by other encounters with healthcare, and the people who are experiencing this want that to be considered very carefully, because it can be very disruptive. Number 9, forego unnecessary questions about physical characteristics and alterations that don't have anything to do with the treatment being undertaken. And then finally, another item that Jeff Bromme mentioned, seeking guidance from transgender patients about their use of their names and how they prefer to be referred to. Doing that at a time when we realize as well that we have legal obligations to have accurate medical records. So that requires some careful attention. So those are the 10 guidelines that were developed, adopted by the board of APA, and are now available in a much more complete form on the website. Questions for the path forward. What issues need most to be addressed now through collaborative attention? What are the best ways to engage knowledgeable colleagues in all of the participating organizations? We know we have expertise there from in the organizations that you folks represent, and how to make best use of that expertise. If we can help each other find that expertise, that will be very useful. And then, how can the consensus statements best be shared? We've been talking about having regular webinars as statements come forward, as we're anticipating one now on health equity and racial justice, which will be discussed later this week by the APA board. So those are a few questions. I'm going to stop sharing screen now and see if any questions have come in, and we have saved, I hope, a useful 15 minutes or so of time to entertain any questions. And I'm going to try to look at those in the chat while I'm also paying attention to you and see. I think that I can't see everyone on the screen, so it won't be helpful to raise your hand. But if you want to, you can try doing that through the reactions box here. Any questions or comments then from what we've presented? Dr. Hart, I see you getting ready.
Well, Jerry, let's have Mark Carr call out his comment in the chat, which I think is an important one, referring to them as transgender persons rather than transgenderism. Mark, you want to elaborate on that? We're going to have trouble muting everybody.
No, wait. They let me loose, Dr. Hart. They let me loose. Thank you. Yes, I think that's supremely important. There are a lot of people in giving care to others who are thoroughly confused and remain confused after many years of trying to figure things out. So one of the things that we do when we face something that is other than us is to attach an ism to it, which identifies immediately that it's not us, it's something else. And I find that, deeply offsetting. And so from whatever perspective we may approach something, it helps, I think, to recognize and to just put it right up front. These are persons, just like every other person we know, and we care for persons in certain ways. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Another question from Esther Berkowitz. You saw that, Jerry? You want to tackle that one as far as current policies within the Adventist healthcare systems?
Well, I won't presume to speak for all of the different systems. One of the challenges of developing these kinds of documents is, actually there are a number of challenges, but one of them is to be very respectful of what our church has put forward, doing that in a way that is nevertheless also clinically appropriate. All of you can probably fill out some of the details on that. But the different systems won't necessarily have the same approach. I will make this prediction. It's fairly easy to predict things that are already going on. We will face increasing legal challenges. Some of you may be acquainted with the Minton case against Dignity Health here in California, where Dignity was challenged legally by a transgender person who was refused, actually just refused for a day or two, care that was being sought in transition. The patient plaintiff prevailed in that, and I think that the system lost on appeal, as I recall. You can look it up as the Minton case and Google it if you like, MINTEN. I think that we'll see more coming down. We're already seeing bills proposed in legislation as well. So one of the reasons that we have a felt need to have these consensus statements is so that we have some shared sense of being together in principle. But as I mentioned, we're not trying to write policies for the system. So I know some systems are not providing gender affirming transitional care because they don't have the expertise to do that. Other systems may be refusing to do it because they don't believe in it. And we didn't pass any judgment about that in the document. Maybe we should have, and maybe that deserves more conversation.
I think if I can maybe comment on behalf of Loma Linda, we've faced this in multiple ways, but the surgical expertise tied to the number of cases you do enough to make you expert is not easy to come by. So that's really one of our challenges, has just been that sheer mechanical question of how many cases and the expertise can you assemble to be good at it.
Yeah. Other questions or comments?
I mean, Jim Walter put a question in there, whether the statement needs to be more affirmative of accepting of transgender persons. Jim, you want to comment more on that and whether that should be called out more?
Oh, Jim won't be. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Here we go. Yeah, Dick, I'm just aware that that I would suppose in some of our hospitals, even in some of our major churches, some of the, not even to speak of transgender persons, but LGBTQ plus persons generally do not feel accepted. And I recognize reasons why, but I don't know just what we should do about it. And some of these churches are affiliated with some of our major medical centers. Is it just that we have to wait until society changes sufficiently that we can safely go ahead, or can we take a more principled approach? And I was noticing, Jerry, in your summary of those 10 principles regarding the document, that there wasn't anything explicitly said. And I wondered about even addressing the question of the full personhood of all of us if that itself is problematic. So I just appreciate some reflection on that by you who have given more thought to this than have I.
I think what I would say, Jim, is that I would encourage everyone to go and read the full statement. The 3 or 4 minutes that I spent summarizing it really doesn't do justice. And then, I don't suppose anyone imagines that that's the final word. I'm sure we would welcome comments for improvements on it. I do see a question that came in, Dick, if it's okay to bring this one forward. What is the process someone asks for, I think the word is elevating, an ethical issue to the APA level? Carlyle, you want to comment on that? How does something get on the agenda? I think you have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yep, thank you for unmuting me. The way it has worked so far is we are curating a list that has been brought by our CEOs. However, I know that they're all very open to receiving input on issues that are surfacing that you believe is worthy of being explored. But right now, we kind of, within the APA team, had a running joke and named the list after one of our CEOs, who shall remain nameless because he came with the longest list. But the reality is that is what we are currently working off of. And I have also noticed that many of our systems, for example, I know AdventHealth has recently done a few position papers, and one of the conversations that Jerry and I we have had is based on the willingness of the various systems as they create position papers and guidelines. Are they willing to share them and have them placed on the ABC website so that others can learn from them and provide input as we are receiving today? So that's the current process. It's a bit clunky, but we are open to input and feedback.
If I can maybe just make a comment here. I would assume most of us on the screen are embedded or related fairly significantly to the healthcare systems and healthcare. Most of our church members, of course, are not. And most of them do not see the world in the way we do not confront the kind of questions that we confront on a daily basis. And so I think as we try to lead the church in this whole world, we need to be delicate and sensitive to that, try to be educational, try to be winsome as we try to bring them along. I know my own journey, what I would have argued very passionately for 20 years ago, I'm on the other side today. And I think I just would plead for all of us to be sensitive to that sort of dichotomy that exists in the church. We are, in a certain sense, representative of the whole. And I think we should take that boldly and with pride, but also recognize the balance that requires as we go forward.
This might be a good time to advertise the session tomorrow. I see Dr. Landless on our screen here, and I know he's been at work on his presentation tomorrow at 2:15 Eastern Time, 11:15 here in the West. Bioethics in the Life of the Adventist World Church. Some of the questions you're thinking of right now might be best posed in that session with Dr. Landless, and we look forward to that.
Yeah, and if I can just add, and I appreciate the sensitivity on this, the fine line between accepting and inclusion and feeling like you're promoting a particular perspective is a very difficult line to walk. And those of us in leadership positions get faced with this all the time in terms of, okay, you're accepting that, but does that mean you're promoting this? I think I can say that on our campus with our 4,500 students, we usually have at least one student a year that transitions. And we don't brag about that. We don't write an article about it, but we quietly accept and support them in that transition. So that's part of that balance, I think, that we have to walk as we're trying to be part of a global church. Any final comments? We have just a couple minutes left, or questions for Jerry or Carlyle in terms of where we're going? Okay, well, thank you all, and I appreciate very much AHPA coming together, and we've had an interesting journey, but now ABC coming alongside. So there's a certain sense to which AHPA and the AHPA board, if I can be apologetic here, is a bunch of us old guys that run health systems getting together and talking about issues. But we need some thinking that goes into that. So appreciate ABC and the deep thinking that goes into that and the nuancing that's so necessary and appropriate to help guide AHPA. So thank you all for participating in this, and I'll turn it back, Jerry, I guess, to you for the next round.
Okay, well, we have this perfect timing. We have a 15-minute break, and we'll start in again at 4:15 on the East Coast, 1:15 here in the West, for the incomparable Dr. Gina Moore, talking about ethics in palliative care, and Dr. Dennis De Leon convening that session. So we'll see you in about 15 minutes. Thank you. Introduce Dr. Dennis De Leon, who is the Chief Medical Officer for AdventHealth Kissimmee, and also the Vice President for Clinical Ethics for the Central Florida Division. And Dennis, please introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Winslow. And today we've already heard some strong messages about treatment at the end of life, particularly from Dr. Bob Macauley earlier. Our speaker presently will be addressing also some issues of ethics in palliative care, but particularly I'd encourage us to listen for twists and turns in the usual narrative of autonomy, in conflict sometimes with beneficence, being sensitive to quality of life issues, concerns about who is competent or has capacity to make decisions and at what point in their disease journey that person may be, and who is legitimately, ethically, and legally able to speak for them. There is a little bit of a standard narrative, I think, in ethics of palliative care, but today's speaker is going to, I think, give us some, arm us with some twists and some other tools to look at nuances in those narratives. And so I'm honored to introduce Dr. Gina Moore for this section. Dr. Moore and I go way back to our family medicine residency training days. I'm honored to have been her colleague from back then, and certainly her accomplishments since then have been many. Gina is the director of the Center for Palliative Care at Loma Linda University Health, and she chairs the ethics committee at Loma Linda University Health Center. So without further ado, Dr. Moore.
Dennis, thank you so much. And Jerry, thanks for inviting me back. I appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for sticking with me to the end. I'm trying to make the most of my American Airlines frequent flyer miles. Since I can't fly, I'm using the free headphones, and so hopefully you can hear me okay. One ear is already out, but maybe that's like one engine still running and the other not. So I'm going to share my screen, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to present two cases that I think are interesting, and I'm going to pause halfway between. So if you want to make comments, questions, Dennis can follow the chat. And after the first case, maybe we'll take some questions and comments, and then we'll go on to the second case. So let's see if we can share this. All right. So we want to talk about ethical issues that arise in the realm of palliative care. And as Dennis mentioned, these aren't particularly common cases. So I thought I'd share some kind of unique cases, and then understand the importance of knowing how to approach these issues. So a couple things to think about as we look at these cases. What do we do when a family member wants to stop a treatment, but the patient says, no, let's keep going? And how do you support a patient who requests physician aid in dying but does not qualify? And be aware of VSED, which is voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. So the first case I'll tell you about is a man I'll call Jim. And this is a case it's been about 5 years ago that I encountered this case. He was a 76-year-old man with pretty significant coronary artery disease. He had had several MIs. His last one had left him in cardiogenic shock. He had severe congestive heart failure, and he actually underwent fairly emergent LVAD placement. So an LVAD is a left ventricular assist device, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But this was placed way back in 2010. And what he had been told at the time, or his family had been told, because he really wasn't well enough to be aware of what was happening, is that, you know, this might buy him a couple years. He unfortunately had pretty significant neurologic injury from a code event. So he basically had had some hypoxic injury. He essentially had to learn to walk and talk and eat again, and he was able to do that. So they had been under the understanding that maybe this would buy him a couple years. And I saw him in 2017. So he had already been surviving with this LVAD for about 7 years. He had developed a driveline infection, which is not unusual. And he had been on antibiotics for a long period of time, but had done pretty well. So here you can see, so what this device does basically is it acts as a pump for when your heart isn't pumping well enough on its own. And typically LVADs are either what we call a bridge therapy. So it's a bridge to buy you time to get you to a heart transplant. Or they're what is euphemistically called destination therapy. Now, when I think of destination therapy, I think of the Bahamas or the Maldives or some beautiful place. But in this case, destination therapy is the LVAD is what you get. And as long as it lasts, you will survive. And when you have complications, then that's it. There is no transplant planned. But essentially a tube gets inserted and hooked onto the heart. It goes out to this pump, which is connected to batteries. So basically you wear kind of a small little backpack, very portable, and people can hopefully engage in the activities that they like to do, except perhaps scuba diving, and really shouldn't play any lacrosse with this. So he was referred to me by the cardiology team for end-of-life care. He'd been having some frequent abdominal pain, some headaches, some intermittent chest pain, but again, he was eating well, he ambulated just with a cane. Sometimes he would feel sudden episodes of weakness and felt like he was going to pass out, and so that kind of limited the activities that they were able to do. And his wife had been his primary caregiver, and she had very much been an advocate for him when he first got sick in 2010, and they were debating whether they should do an LVAD or not. She very much advocated for that. And as many of the patients that I see who are kind of in a crisis situation, you know, their families just want you to do anything you can to help them survive and save their life. So here it is now 7 years later, and this is a man who can't be left alone. When I met with him, he said, you know, my wife is just so amazing. She takes such great care of me, but I think she's exhausted. And, you know, I've heard her say, I can't do this anymore, which the wife says, no, I've never said that. And the patient says, you know, I could just not replace the battery when the battery runs out. So you always have backup batteries with these LVADs. But he said, you know, I'm worried that this might actually be equivalent to suicide. And he was a fairly devout Catholic. And even though he had actually talked with someone from his faith community, a priest had said, no, this isn't the same as suicide. He just could not quite get over that feeling that that's what it was. So he now gets a new driveline infection. So that tube that goes into the heart comes out of the skin. Obviously, it's a nidus for infection. And the things that people with LVADs often die from are either things like hemorrhagic strokes, because they have to be on Coumadin, because here you have a foreign body that's prone to clotting. So you have to anticoagulate these people. And then they're also prone to infections. So that's usually what takes their life. So he gets this pretty severe infection, and, the family is told, we're not sure if if we're gonna be able to take care of this infection or not. He gets sent home with 6 weeks of IV antibiotics. And he kind of decides that, after that, he really doesn't want to keep coming in and out of the hospital. He doesn't want more interventions. And his wife is keeping faithful account of all the symptoms that he has. But most of the time when I see him, he doesn't remember most of these. So if you think of someone who has dementia, who's pretty pleasant, but doesn't remember anything about what they had for breakfast a few hours ago, his mental status is similar to that. So he can do all his activities of daily living. I mean, he doesn't pay bills or drive or anything like that, but he can take care of himself. But his memory is quite poor, and so he doesn't really recall all of these things. And interestingly enough, they come in to clinic, and just a few weeks before, they had signed on with hospice because they'd been told by the cardiac team, if we stop these antibiotics, we think that this infection will just kind of take over. And although he was fairly stable, they decided to get some extra support from hospice. He was on a little bit of hydrocodone at night for pain, some lorazepam for anxiety. And the family asks about turning off the LVAD. And in fact, they had asked about this prior. But the interesting thing is, when you had a conversation with both the patient and the wife, the patient would say, I can't remember much, but, I think things are going okay, and I'm feeling okay, and I'm good with how things are. So I'm good with continuing things the way they are. And the wife would kind of roll her eyes and show me the list of symptoms that he had had in the last week that he seemed to be really quite oblivious of. And so she really looked at him and said, he has a really poor quality of life. But whenever I asked him about how he was feeling, he thought his quality of life was not too bad. So he actually, I have an amazing occupational therapist who does legacy building with some of our patients, and she started working with him, and they started doing legacy building exercises. He worked on projects such as letters for all of his grandkids for the future. So that was keeping him busy. But he was getting weaker. He was eating less. And in fact, they had actually talked with the cardiology team about having his implanted defibrillator turned off. Since he was on hospice and didn't want to return to the hospital, we didn't think that having his defibrillator go off when he had an arrhythmia would make much sense. So that was discontinued. But he continued to have what he would say is an acceptable quality of life. And then they visited with me again, and the wife said, he said that he wants his LVAD turned off. And he turns to me and says, I might have said that, but I don't remember that at all. And then he still went back to this issue of, I don't know if this is okay. I think this might be suicide. And so he was still very concerned about that. So this was an interesting case where you had really not just the wife, but the children who said, Dad's quality of life has been declining. We don't think that he would want to be like this. We think that back when he was able to think better, that he would have said this is a poor quality of life. So he gets more and more confused. And one night he is really having a very bad night. And the family all decides, and they had been talking with this LVAD was not placed at Loma Linda. It was actually placed at an outside facility, but they had been in close contact with that program. And they had kind of walked them through the how to turn off the LVAD. And he died very comfortably at home with all of his family surrounding him on hospice. Which was, so my cell phone sometimes gets bad reception at my home. And I had been planning to make a home visit on a Sunday. And they had called the night before, and I never got those calls to let me know that he had declined, that the LVAD had been stopped, and that he had died. So I showed up Sunday morning at their house not knowing that he had died, and they filled me in on this. And they kind of went through kind of the process. So again, by far and away, what we see, at least what I see the majority of the time, are patients who say, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm tired. I feel horrible. I want to stop going to the hospital. I want to stop chemo. I want to stop blood transfusions, whatever it is. And family members kind of rallying around saying, no, 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 come on, you can do this, Dad. Let's keep going. So I think it's not very common that we see this picture instead. So I'm going to pause for just a bit to see if folks have questions or comments. Ever been in a similar situation? How do we negotiate that?
And Gina, thank you for that case presentation. While we wait for some responses, I find myself with a question, and that is, from the picture you painted in your story, was there any sense that the patient had diminished decision-making capacity, or you mentioned some confusion and possible forgetfulness, although that might have been colored by his wife's bias in another direction. But, you know, clinically, what would you say about the patient's decision-making?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think he had limited decision-making capacity. I think if he was being worked up for something really complicated, involved, like a heart transplant, I don't think he could have made that decision. I think we would have relied on the family to help really weigh the benefits versus the cons. But he could certainly, you know, make certain decisions, fairly easy decisions. And again, kind of like someone who has dementia, they may be feeling okay right then and not remember that yesterday they felt horrible. And so I think in ethics, sometimes we think about, you know, where do we draw the line between honoring the person that you used to be versus the person that you are now? And who is your true authentic self? I think that issue comes up.
Right, some deep, possibly even metaphysical questions. Some of the commentators on the chat mentioned how difficult it is when two elderly parents form a couple, one of which is the caregiver, and that person may be as much under stress and may even have physical illness comparable to the patient, quote unquote. And another comment was there ever a place for a psychiatry consult to clarify any of those issues around the patient's clarity of thought?
Yeah, so great questions. You know, here at Loma Linda, there's kind of this crossover between who helps determine decision-making capacity, whether that's psychiatry or ethics. And it kind of seems to stem from, if you think it's a mental health issue, then maybe it's more psychiatry, but if it's a medical problem, it's more ethics. And sometimes the two do not always agree. I do not believe he ever saw psychiatry. This was a case that we kind of talked about in our ethics meetings, and I talked extensively with cardiology about. Cardiology felt very uncomfortable, felt like this was caregiver fatigue, and that the wife was just kind of done. And really, when you talked with her more, it was a lot more nuanced than that. It was a lot more, I mean, she was very devoted. I don't think he would have survived 7 years without her meticulous care. But she really viewed a decline in his quality of life that she was concerned about. And I think there was fatigue as well, no question. And so I think we really tried to figure out what can we do to help support her. You know, unfortunately, all of their kids worked, so they couldn't be directly involved. There is limited support for caregivers in this country, unfortunately. You know, there is no, you know, there's limited home health support, and then there's hospice support, but nothing kind of in between for kind of custodial type care. So that makes it really, really challenging. And I think I think we need to do a better job of supporting our caregivers.
Jerry, you mentioned a movie that I had an opportunity to see recently called The Farewell. Maybe you'd like to illuminate on your own comment.
Oh, I just, for a number of years, I did work in the People's Republic of China, and there the expectation was that the family would make decisions like this. And they were sort of shocked and horrified that I remember teaching 400 medical students at one time at Zhejiang University, and they were expressing their surprise. I think it went beyond surprise, shock and horror that you would ask a sick person who is, only maybe dubiously able to make these decisions, that you would put that burden on that person rather than on the family. It seemed unkind to them.
Yeah.
So there is this film that many of you probably seen called The Farewell that is actually a pretty clever exploration of that question, I think.
Yeah, I'm seeing a couple other questions that I want to address. Jim, thank you for your question about was he able to engage? I think minimally. I think if anything, he essentially gave assent rather than consent. But again, I think that he was having some delirium near the end. And I think that really, I think the family really did the best they could based on, I think, surrogate decision-making. And I think, then when he really lost even his ability to maybe even assent, I think they really thought about what was in his not only best interest, but what would he say if he could think clearly and see how he was doing now. And Ted, thank you for your question. Did I recommend or support? I think I did both. I told both cardiology and the family, I said, you know what, we withdraw and stop treatments all the time. And a patient can tell me when they want to stop things whenever they want to. However, what I'm hearing from my patient earlier on was I'm okay with keeping going. And I think that gave everybody pause. And I think they felt like, okay, well, we will continue until we knew he would worsen at some point. And in fact, he did. So I think supporting them as best I could with symptom management, but also then a little bit of the ethics part of, what can and should we do at this point in time? So. And that's a great question about advanced directives. I think there was an advanced directive. And I think it gave the usual kind of vague, my wife is my decision maker. And when I lose capacity, I don't want heroic things, which is kind of the path we were going down. But again, there was nothing specific about what if my family wants to stop an LVAD and I don't. So that made it a challenge. So thank you for those questions, comments. I'm going to share with you our next case, and we'll leave some time for more questions. So this case, this is Sue, and that is actually her name. She actually really wanted her story shared and was going to do a video recording. Unfortunately, she got sicker before we could do that. But this was a woman that I met in early 2019, a 95-year-old, really one of my healthier patients. And her chief concern was, I just feel awful. She was a little weak, a little unsteady on her feet, but she was really physically in pretty good shape. She said, I feel like I'm losing my mind. I just can't remember things the way I'd like to. I was concerned that she was anxious and depressed, and she had been seen by geriatric psychiatry before she even saw me. And they had made some recommendations. She also had some symptoms. Main one that when I first saw her was some abdominal bloating and some nausea, and just didn't feel very good. She had been living in an assisted living facility for a couple of years, and she had really liked it at first. But she had gotten to the point where she said, I'm so bored. I'm so tired of all the activities. We just do the same thing over and over. So she'd gotten tired of that. And she had actually been approached there in the facility about whether she wanted to go on hospice or not. And my challenge was, I'm not sure what the hospice diagnosis would be. Those of you who work in circles where hospice gets brought up, as you know, you have to have a terminal illness with a prognosis of 6 months or less if the disease follows its usual course. And really for those of us who know that's a really hard thing to prognosticate, sometimes it's easier to say, would I be surprised if this person died in the next 6 months? And I actually would have been surprised. And so I didn't think it made sense for her to be on hospice. She did have some mild congestive heart failure. Her EF was 45%, but that really, I don't think, was what was mostly limiting her physical or functional status. So I tried we use olanzapine or Zyprexa quite a bit in palliative care, mainly because it helps with symptoms. It's a kind of a second line therapy for chemo-induced nausea in the cancer center, but it helps with improving appetite, it helps with mood, it helps with sleep. So we kind of like it in general. And in fact, this helped her GI symptoms feel a bit better. So she was eating and sleeping fairly well. But every time, she comes in, she looks great, she's smiling. And then when I say, well, how are you doing? She's, oh, I'm just miserable, just miserable. And she asked about California's End-of-Life Option Act. So for those of you who remember, in 2016, California passed its own law for physician aid in dying, kind of modeled after Oregon's Death with Dignity law. And we've talked about that at this conference in the past. Now that it's been, it's been 5 years since it was passed, and I can still count on just one hand the number of people who have inquired about that. But she was determined. She thought this was the right thing for her, and she was ready to get a prescription. So just in brief, the End-of-Life Option Act in California says that this is for any California resident who's an adult with a terminal illness, with a prognosis of 6 months or less. So very much kind of the same population that would typically be referred to hospice. It has to be certified by both an attending and consulting physician. So two different folks who also said, listen, they don't have any mental health issue that is impacting their capacity. They have to make 2 verbal requests that are 2 weeks apart, as well as a written request. Now, the latest thing in California is that there is I think, legislation pending to maybe change that to a waiting period of only 48 hours, because some folks, they've done some data collection that looks like many people who are waiting in that 2-week period of time are dying before they're actually able to avail themselves of this. And then finally, you have to be able to actually ingest this lethal dose of a medication on your own. So if you have ALS and you can't physically ingest it or even put it in your own G-tube, that would theoretically make it so that you do not qualify. So does this patient qualify for physician aid in dying? I did not think she did. So besides the fact that Loma Linda opted out of this, and that is not how I ever that's not the first thing I say when people ask about this. We always like to ask about, tell me why you're interested in that. Tell me more about what you know about it. Tell me about why this is something you feel is the right thing for you. Long before we talk about the fact that Loma Linda has opted out. But she really did not qualify. And I told her that. I told her kind of what the law was. And her daughter very much understood that, but she was not happy. So let me tell you a little bit more about her. Just a couple years ago, she had written a book that was kind of an autobiography. She gave me a copy of it. It's a great little book. And she had really been this amazing woman who had lived this exciting life. Her husband had been in the CIA, so they had lived all over the world. She had been widowed 3 times. Her last husband, they had been married for about a couple of years, and he actually developed renal failure and decided not to go on dialysis, and she had taken care of him on hospice. She had 3 daughters. One had preceded her in death from cancer. The other one who came to all her visits to see me was a retired nurse and was an amazing advocate for her mother. And she was a Catholic with very strong faith. So, she returns. We try different things. I think at first she's maybe depressed, and then I'm not really sure that she's depressed. I think when she talks about being, tired of things, I think she was just kind of what we call tired of life. We had tried Lexapro, Ritalin. Those didn't really seem to make much of a difference. She's very worried that her memory is declining. She can't remember her grandkids' names, and just really worried that that's going to get worse. And she'll tell me that there's nothing in life that she enjoys. And then her daughter looks at her and says, but Mom, you enjoyed us coming to visit you the other day. And she said, well, yeah, I still enjoy my family. And she enjoyed books on tape. So there were a few things that she enjoyed. But it just wasn't, life was not giving her the quality that she felt was acceptable. And she wanted out. So she again requested physician aid in dying. I again said, you do not qualify. You're one of my healthier patients. And she really feared a long, slow, drawn out death. She did not want to face that. So it was the first time I'd actually, I knew about voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. I've heard about it at various ethics conferences, and I find it an interesting topic, but I had never actually really dealt with a patient who that might be the right thing for. So what is this? It's really for people who have what some would say is refractory suffering, however you define that. And they often have some advanced illness, maybe symptoms, maybe pain, maybe some other symptoms, maybe just weakness and progressive functional decline, so they can't do the things they want to do. One study showed that it really happens, the majority of people who do this are over the age of 80, but they actually consciously choose to stop eating and drinking. So I'm not talking about not putting in feeding tubes, but saying, I'm just not going to eat and drink anymore. And so that's different than the usual. I see many people in the cancer center who have cancer, anorexia, cachexia, who they just don't feel like eating, they're nauseated. This is very different. This is actually, I feel hungry, but I am not going to eat or drink anything. Most would say it is ethically and legally different than physician aid in dying. So whereas physician aid in dying entails someone else being involved in giving you a prescription for a lethal dose of something, this is something that you just decide to stop doing on your own. Also different than what we think of as suicide in folks who have severe depression. Although there are some ethicists who would say, no, this is actually more like suicide than not. It's not very common. It's not particularly easy to do. So, you think about when you're hungry and thirsty, you want to get that drink and get your next meal. Those feelings usually will go away once your endorphins start to kick in. And death usually occurs in about 10 days to 2 weeks. Usually people get dehydrated within a couple of weeks. So it's a very specific process, and again, one that's not very common. So then what happened? April of 2020, COVID hit. My patient was in this skilled nursing, assisted living facility that got locked down. Her daughter was very, very worried about what would happen if she got sick. She really didn't want to go to the hospital. There were a couple hired caregivers that went in, that were allowed in briefly, but family wasn't allowed in. Patient was getting more confused, was having a hard time using a phone, using an iPad. And so we actually, at this point in time, decided to get hospice started. I honestly didn't know if the hospice would agree that she qualified for hospice, but with these change in circumstances, we got hospice involved, and they were such a great support to her while she was kind of stuck in her assisted living facility, mostly by herself. And it gave the daughter tremendous peace of mind that if something happened, she would not be taken to the hospital and that they could take care of her there. But I got a call on June 5 of 2020. And the call was that my patient had fallen and she broke her hip. And they brought her to the emergency department. And the daughter really wanted to talk to me about, what do we do? Do we do surgery? The surgeons came, they said, oh, she's a pretty healthy 95-year-old. She should have no problem with surgery. But they just weren't sure if that was the right thing. So we kind of talked through these issues. On the one hand, she had still been ambulatory. And if she didn't have surgery, she would no longer be ambulatory. The other thing is that sometimes it's really hard to maintain good pain control even with just trying to turn people when their hip is fractured. So we weighed it all out and we decided to proceed with surgery, mainly for good symptom management and to at least help her maintain what quality of life she did have. And she sailed through surgery and felt pretty good the next day, but 2 days later, she wasn't doing so well. She got a little bit confused, a little delirious, and she decided she didn't want to go to the skilled nursing facility for physical therapy, as would be the typical course. I talked with the daughter again and talked about, what's the next step. And the daughter decided, if mom really wants to, if we're looking at the end of mom's life, I want to take her home instead of going back to her assisted living facility, and we'll take her back home with hospice. And then this idea again of voluntary stopping of eating and drinking came up, because we all know that hip fractures can be pretty serious, but a quarter of people can recover and regain close to their baseline. And she decided this was kind of the last straw. And so she actually decided to stop eating and drinking. She went home on June 9, and her daughter texted me on June 20 that she had died very comfortably and peacefully at home with all of her family surrounding her. So I want to show you, this is Sue's Zoom memorial back in August. And she was really an amazing woman. And I love, I got this picture from the memorial that really kind of epitomizes, I think, who she was. And this picture, it really is not all that old. I want to say at the very latest, she was maybe in her late 80s here, but could have actually been in her early 90s. She was a woman who just loved life, loved her family, really loved everything. And so I think for me, some parting thoughts is, I think we have to be careful about what we assume about quality of life and who gets to make those decisions. And I think that more than anything, that every person is an individual that you have to really think about in their context of themselves and their family, and help them develop a plan that works for them, whether if that's the plan that you would want for yourself or not. So with that, I will stop sharing. And Dennis, I'll turn it over to you for some moderation.
I hope I can provide that in moderation, Gina. That was a great story. Really a pair of great stories. And there's some great comments that you should read in the chat box that you're best off reading on your own. But let me just say that I see just a challenging connection and a contrast between your first case, Gina, and your second one, because it seems to me in your first case, there was a person whose their conception of the quality of life was higher in his own estimation than perhaps his immediate, family member, at least his wife, who was his major context. And then in the second case, there's the picture of just a wonderful woman whose conception of her own quality of life is actually significantly lower, right, than most outside observers might rate her. They would look at her life and her vibrancy and her history and everything you showed us, and they would say, wow, you've got it pretty good. Physically, you're in decent health. Your doctor can't even find a hospice diagnosis for you, has trouble looking for one. And yet her conception is lower than what people in her surroundings might rate her as. And I think it was one of the famous end-of-life writers, it could have been Philip Levine, who said that, in the end, all of us human beings have the privilege of being the artist of our own canvas, right? And creating the artistry, the tapestry that defines our lives. And we can do that as we wish to do it. And we can ignore, to some extent, the contravailing opinions of even our loved ones or the people closest to us, and come up with a different formula for ourselves than what people around us say. So yeah, let me just open it up to comments, including some of the very good comments that are posted in the chat.
You know, I will just say that one of the things that is coming up kind of in the ethics world, in the advanced directive world, is discussions about people with dementia having a specific dementia advanced directive that says, when I get to the point when I don't recognize people, but I am still eating, if you put a spoon up to my mouth, I will open my mouth and chew and swallow, not because I really am making a decision, but just kind of reflexively. People are wanting to put in an advanced directive that says, don't even offer me food and water. It's gaining traction in Canada. It's probably going to come here as well. So it's beyond the don't put in feeding tubes when I can't swallow. It's the don't even offer it to me. And again, is bringing up a lot of debate, particularly in nursing facilities. Nursing facilities say, listen, we do basic care. We honor and respect your wish not to have feeding tubes, but you can't tell us not to offer you food and drink. And if you take it, then we're going to keep offering it. So I think that's going to be kind of the next horizon that we'll be seeing. This was a little different. I think this patient had very clear decision-making capacity. I really struggled with this one because what I saw in front of me was this vibrant, amazing woman. And I think I want to say the name of her book was Around the World in 94 years or 93 years, because she wrote it when she was in her late 90s, but I can get that. And so it was really hard for me to say, you know, this is an option. And I will tell you that I brought up VSED with her because I thought that was, from my standpoint, an ethically permissible option that she might be interested in. Her family in no way, her family supported her in whatever she wanted to do. Neither, I think if anything, they said, Mom, we love you. We'd like to still have you here. We love to come visit you. But she just, I think after the hip fracture, that was just it for her.
Any thoughts on the role of the physician in supporting this versus discouraging it, particularly in the setting of, and I noticed you went through a really comprehensive workup. Several different antidepressants were given to her at various times. So it sounds like this is clearly more, your term is wonderful, refractory suffering, or, you know, I just can't help think of this German word, lebensmüde. You know, to be weary of life, so to speak, or existentially at one's end. And there's a clear picture that I think that's coming to mind when you describe your patient, Gina. Were you at one time or another in debating her, or did you feel like you were?
You know, yeah, somewhat. I mean, I really felt like I was, you know, on the one hand, I wanted to empathize with her and be her ally. And yet I wanted her to understand why physician aid in dying was not an option. Tried really hard to see if we could help her feel better. And you know, I think I think there were some things we did that did help relieve some of her symptoms, but despite all the other medications we tried, didn't really change her underlying situation. And I think that's one of the toughest spots to be in when someone, I don't think that she was, I don't think she was depressed. I think she was just, she had lived her life and said, I've done everything I want to do. I don't see a point in continuing on if I'm going to continue to decline, because she did see a decline. And I think that's a really hard, that's hard for me to know what to do with.
Yeah. And I'll pass it back to Dr. Winslow, but I just wanted to mention that Jerry, you yourself, and also Francis pointed out that one can now legitimately ask, are the legitimate goals of medicine inclusive of things like helping you not to be bored, helping you not to be sad, coaching you for voluntary cessation of eating and drinking, helping you with your family dynamics. What if her family could have embraced her in some way that brought her, out of the nursing home more quickly, reintegrated her into life activities? Could they have uplifted her enough to change the existential state that she found herself in? And is it in fact part of medicine's task to do those things? So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Dr. Winslow.
Oh, that's a whole session, I think, in addition to what we've just done. But thank you, Dr. Gina Moore, for making those questions so vivid for us. Some of you know Dr. Farr Curlin, theologian and physician, who's spent quite a bit of time thinking that through, along with people like Gina Moore, the legitimate aims and goals of medicine. So we've come to the end of the day. Thank you, Dennis, for leading us here. We will assemble again tomorrow, those of you who are willing to join us, at 1 o'clock on the East Coast, 10 o'clock out here. Dr. Carla Park will again be presenting a devotional. Those of you who heard Carla this morning, I'm sure will want to be present for that at the appropriate time. Then that will be followed by another address by Dr. Robert Macauley, who we heard this morning. Other great presentations coming up tomorrow on a similar schedule. If you have any comments or questions about the way things have functioned, you're always welcome to email me. It's gwinslow@llu.edu. I think most of you already know that. Thank you for a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us today. Hope to see you back here again tomorrow. Bye.